Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Kartik. I want to welcome all of you to the UniCode DAO Talks. So all of you are watching this thing on ETHGlobal.tv. This is a live platform we're using for the next few hours. So if you have any questions for our speakers, if you have any comments, you can type them up in chat, and I encourage
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone.
To log in, and we'll be able to relay those questions directly to our speakers. All right. So this event is brought to you by ETHGlobal. And for those of you who don't know, ETHGlobal is an organization with a very simple mission. Our goal is to bring on thousands of developers into the Web3 ecosystem. So we cover everything in the Web3 ecosystem by doing summits and hackathons, and UniCode is one of our events covering both the best of both worlds. So UniCode is a hackathon that's going on for 2 weeks, where we have over 320 hackers from 40 different countries in spanning 17 different time zones working on the latest and the greatest on the Uniswap Protocol. And on top of that, we have over 20 ecosystem mentors, 6 technical mentors, and 7 partners who are helping all of our hackers get to the best of what the projects they want to build. So today is DAO Talks. We're going to cover a lot of stuff around what's happening with DAOs, and I'm going to quickly give an overview of what the next few hours look like, and then we'll go right into our very first talk. So we're going to talk about what worker cooperatives look like in DAOs, how should we think about co-ops and patronage tokens, just a legal framework on how we come up with a better legal understanding of how we can structure DAOs. We're going to have another discussion on these legal DAO structures. We're going to talk about collaboration at the governance level, and also go into some philosophy around Looks like we're experiencing some technical difficulties, but Connor, if you can introduce yourself, would love for you to kick off with what the rest of today looks like, and we'll jump right into our very first talk.
Amazing. Thanks, Kartik. So hi all, thanks for joining. I'm Connor Spelsey, and I'm here today representing the DAO Research Collective. We organized today's speakers with the help, of course, of the amazing folks at ETHGlobal and Uniswap Grants. I'm a former lawyer. I'm the co-founder of the Blockchain Association, and I'm also the founder of the DAO Research Collective. So DAOs are, of course, cutting-edge organizational structures. Don't have to tell any of you that, I'm sure, but there's really very limited precedent for how DAO stakeholders operate their DAOs. DAO stakeholders are starting to think about things like I'm sure many of you are starting to think about around legal, governance, treasury management, etc. But much of that information is still really being siloed inside particular DAOs. Now, we've brought together today's group of speakers to help push more of that information out to the community, particularly around DAO structuring and governance today. Our goal at the DAO Research Collective generally is to accelerate DAO functionality by open sourcing and procuring research foundational to effective DAO operation. We think the research being presented here today is exactly that. And so we're proud to be providing grants to many of the speakers for the research that they've prepared today. We'll continue to host more events like today's, support research, and encourage more cooperation between DAOs. If you're interested in getting involved, you can reach out to me on Twitter at C_Spelsey, or check us out at DAOcollective.xyz. And I'm sure the same goes for Kartik as it relates to ETHGlobal. They put on a ton of amazing events. And so I'd highly recommend you check out their website to make sure that you're up to date with what they're doing. Before we start, I do want to thank ETHGlobal for putting this on and for all their amazing work in the space, and also Uniswap Grants for their support and their amazing work. Now, as always, just a little bit of housekeeping for today. None of the information provided by our speakers is legal or investment advice in any way. You need to consult professionals or lawyers before taking any action. And with that, I believe we have Bill Warren on the line, and I'm very honored to introduce him as our first speaker. Bill is the executive steward of product and technology at Opolis. I saw him speak at LizCon just last week, and he did an amazing job. And so I'm sure he'll do the same today. So Bill, I think that we can now bring you up. There you are, sir.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I will leave you.
Awesome. Yep. So also just want to reiterate what Connor said. Nothing I'm saying is legal advice. I'm actually a former lawyer, so that means don't listen to me. And it gives me the permission, at least in my mind, to be a little bit spicier with some of my legal takes than maybe some of the folks that are still practicing out there in the world. So I work for Opolis, which is an employment commons. We are what I'd like to think of as an employment DAO, where we offer payroll benefits and shared services to freelancers, especially in the crypto and DAO space. And we do this by being legally a cooperative in the state of Colorado. So I truly believe that it's helpful to start at the beginning and kind of think about what are DAOs and how DAOs intersect with the future of work. We believe the future of work is DAO. More people than ever are kind of trading that 40 years at IBM with a golden pin at the end for freelance work. And the next iteration of that kind of freelancer work is working for DAOs or NFT projects that are really kind of like quasi DAOs, and gaining that financial and employment freedom, which is fantastic, but it doesn't mean that you can kind of transcend the need to pay taxes or have benefits for yourself, since at least in the US, those are very important to being kind of functioning members of society and also protecting yourself and your family from risk. At Opolis, we started because we saw this trend of workers moving to independence. This is something where obviously this chart goes back to 2019, but really, starting in the 70s and 80s, you saw more and more mobility from workers where they were switching companies. And now we've seen workers, rather than switching companies, kind of declaring themselves freelancers and going for a lifestyle that allows them to truly control their working life day to day, pick who they work for, when they work, where they work. All of that is great. And all of that is kind of being seen in the DAO space as well. On the Opolis side, a lot of our members in the cooperative are those who work for DAOs, and we've seen a huge jump in membership in the last year as DAOs have taken off and more people are working full-time for DAOs. To give a quick kind of introduction on how DAOs work, at least in my mind, obviously most of you all know this, but I like to think of DAOs as just kind of simple collectives where people come together around a shared interest or project. They put together a treasury of tokens. Maybe those tokens are reputational, maybe those tokens represent capital or some other form of assets. And then they use decentralized governance mechanisms to distribute that treasury and make decisions on how they allocate those assets to achieve those goals. We see this in practice in DAOs that range in mission from something like Metagama Delta, which is an amazing organization of women in the space that are supporting other women with grants, to more investment type DAOs like the Lao or Metacartel Ventures, where those are typically accredited investors making actual investments in other Web3 projects, to something like DAO House, where I also contribute, and that's a kind of DAO that is building a product for others to use. It just also happens to be a DAO that is building a DAO platform. I do think it's nice to kind of take a little bit of a historical, maybe side quest here, and mention that DAOs are not the gig economy. I think the gig economy came about with a lot of promise, but quickly turned out to be exploitative. And the big problem, which is a problem that DAOs solve, is that within the gig economy, power was still concentrated in these traditional corporations where the corporation was governed by the idea of shareholder primacy, where everything the corporation does needs to be increasing the value of the shareholders and their shares in the corporation. that means that a lot of the focus of these companies was to increase the wealth of their venture capitalists, the early employees who owned shares, and kind of anybody else that invested in the company, often at the expense of those who were users of the platform, either gig workers or those utilizing gig workers, and also probably later employees. DAOs truly give a way for all stakeholders to participate in value creation in a way that we really haven't seen. Obviously, a lot of that value creation is in a legal gray area still, if you start to think about the securities laws. But I do and see this, and I am hopeful that this is kind of a trend towards a more stakeholder economy rather than kind of late stage capitalism that has become pretty exploitative. So I think, what we do at Opolis is help people figure out how to work for DAOs. And this is where I feel like I can be a little bit more spicy YOLO than some of the practicing attorneys, because I think a lot of DAOs are meant to exist ephemerally. If you're running a investment DAO, of course, kind of like Foreman LLC, keep it to accredited investors, keep the number reasonable, under 100 for Investment Act purposes. If you're doing what we do at Opolis, where you need a legal entity, form a cooperative, right? That does kind of give a lot more of the stakeholder economics, or gives the potential for a lot more of the stakeholder economics that DAOs represent and DAOs should be striving for, because we can return profits in the form of patronage to members across kind of membership classes. But then again, a lot of DAOs, until there's like a really good kind of DAO form, which I don't believe exists yet, are going to exist ephemerally because they exist across borders. And that's okay. Because, one thing that we do is help people who work for ephemeral DAOs protect themselves from a liability perspective and access traditional benefits and payroll services. So our prototypical member is Patty, who works for DAOs. She loves working for DAOs, but her problem is she gets paid in DAI. She has zero purchasing power in terms of getting benefits, and she doesn't have a W-2, which makes it kind of hard to get like home loans or car loans and participate in the normie economy still. The solution we recommend at Opolis, and again, talk to your lawyer, make sure this is right for you, is that people should be wrapping themselves in LLCs or S Corps in order to provide themselves individual liability protection. And that way the DAO pays the LLC or the S Corp, and then the S Corp or LLC pays the individual contributor. This allows DAOs to remain more internet native and ephemeral if they want to. It protects the individual contributors with entities, which I think is important in the long run. And I think DAOs should be responsible and think about how to protect those who contribute to the DAOs. And it also confers tax advantages to the contributors. Where we at Opolis take it a step further is, rather than having these S Corps and LLCs exist in a vacuum, we kind of bundle them under the Employment Commons LCA, which is, again, a Colorado cooperative. And this structure allows us to be people's co-employer. So while Patty might have Patty Corp that gets paid by the DAO, she can also have Opolis or the Employment Commons LCA as her co-employer. That way, Patty Corp can use the Employment Commons for running payroll and tax compliance. She can also access benefits through the Employment Commons. So rather than going out to the kind of individual markets or trying to find a broker for herself and her maybe one business partner, she or they can access benefits through the Employment Commons, where we negotiate for everybody in the commons. So it's a lot more akin to the rates that you would get working at a large startup or organization. You also get a W-2 this way. So in a lot of ways, the legal structure around the Employment Commons allows us to give people who work for DAOs the experience of working for a larger traditional corporation while actually still getting paid in DAI from some ephemeral internet organization. So, this creates a one-stop shop for Patty, but I think the other nice thing about co-ops that, mentioned a little bit in the background is that Patty's not only a user or customer of Opolis and the Employment Commons, but Patty's a member and owner of the Employment Commons. And that means that she can share in patronage and the benefits of the commons. That way, if we run a profit, kind of like REI, Patty can get some of the fees that she's paid into the commons back. She could at some point realize, patronage, and that kind of looks like a little bit of profits. And because we're, Web3 forward, we're tracking patronage and tracking governance rights within the commons and within our DAO using the work token. So we are, not going plain vanilla on our cooperative structure. we are pushing the boundaries there a little bit by saying, why don't we tokenize, governance, tokenize patronage, and reward people like Patty for their consumption of the common services, whether that be payroll, or reward her for helping recruit new members to the commons or providing other value to the commons. Maybe Patty is a great developer and she helps in the future develop technology that the commons uses. She would receive work tokens for that as well. This means those who contribute more have more governance, have a greater share of patronage, and we've created this kind of dynamic stakeholder economy that I believe really transcends and fixes a lot of the problems of the prior gig economy and the challenges that freelancers faced. So in summary, I'm going to say with a few caveats, our opinion is let DAOs be DAOs, right? If you need a legal structure, I would say, one, talk to a lawyer, but think kind of carefully about what legal structure you want to take. If it's the investment club, sure, go with an LLC in Wyoming or Delaware. If it is more of a project-based kind of DAO that you have and you really want to distribute value across stakeholders, I would strongly recommend a Colorado cooperative, just because you can do a lot more and there's a lot more flexibility there in terms of distributing value to those stakeholders. In any case, this I do want to kind of reiterate and strongly push is that please protect individual contributors as you're creating the DAO, right? People are working hard for your DAO, contributing, make sure they've wrapped themselves in some sort of limited liability entity so that if the SEC or whoever is looking at the DAO and they're looking through to the membership, that those members are protected in some way. And, if you are a DAO and you've got a bunch of great contributors that need benefits and, payroll services and tax compliance, please send them to Opolis. Sorry, that's my little shill at the end. So that's all I have for today, and looking forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers.
Amazing. Thank you, Bill. Much appreciated. And I think, Bill, will you also be joining us for the panel later on?
I will. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so you'll get more Bill content in just about an hour. And now we're going to move on to Yev Muchnik and Jacqueline Radabau. So Yev and Jacqueline are both lawyers at J. Wiener. And we've been working with Yev and Jacqueline on a paper recently that they are drafting on structuring DAOs as cooperatives, so at least portions of DAOs as cooperatives. So I am very excited to dive a little bit further with them on that today. So we have Jacqueline here, and I imagine we'll see Yev. Yev is currently missing at the moment, but maybe I'll leave it to Jacqueline to get started. Thanks, Jacqueline.
Hi there. So yeah, thank you for having us. Oh, there you go. Yev is joining us. So I'll let her get us started, and I'll talk to you in a second.
Sorry, I'm just sharing my screen. So Bear with me for a second, please. My name is Yev Muchnik, and I'm joined by my colleague, Jackie Radabo. We're here to talk about DAO co-ops and patronage tokens, and grateful to Bill for setting the stage to some of the work that we're doing here in Colorado. So we are with a law firm called Jason Weiner PC based out of Boulder, Colorado. I also have my firm, which is called Launch Legal, and I'm of counsel to Jason's firm. I'll let Jackie provide some background on her work as well.
Yeah, so I've been working with the firm since January 2021 with background in cooperative corporate taxation between Brazil and nonprofit working in Europe, and started working with Yev earlier this summer on the overlap of my work in blockchain, and we found it to be DAO's work. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you about what we're doing. I think that's what I have on my thanks.
And so my background is more traditional corporate and securities. I kind of took a deep dive into the crypto and blockchain space back in 2016 with the influx of ICOs, have been around to watch it mature and participate in molding it. I'd like to think that I've had some hand in molding the maturity of the space as well from a legal perspective, and really excited to amalgamate some of the work that we're doing with kind of the traditional layering of corporate structuring and formation, and the Web3 technical framework on top of that. Just a little bit more background about our firm. Jason Weiner PC is preeminently known in the country for its work in the co-op space. We're a boutique business law, so we concentrate on shared ownership, creative financing, securities, employee ownership co-ops, co-op development, and business consultancy across different sectors and industries. And we've got a team of 6 core attorneys and 4 contractors and 40 years of combined cooperative experience. So we are actually practicing lawyers. So we, unlike Connor and Bill, who made the kind of caveat disclaimer that they are not, but we are. And so none of the information that we are disseminating here is intended to be legal advice. It's just for educational purposes. But we are certainly deep into it, and hopefully you'll enjoy the discourse and kind of share your ideas as well via Twitter or via email. So please feel free to engage or by questions through the seminar. So why are we here today, and what is our presentation about? We kind of based on our core work in the cooperative space and the Web3 space, we are seeing that there is very much a revolt against the traditional corporate form of corporations, and the way that they've been structured, the way that they've been evolved, or the way that they are evolving. Traditionally they're top down in terms of governance. They are all about shareholder maximization, and really an asymmetry in power, and that just doesn't align with sort of the kind of groups that we're working with, especially in the DAO space. So DAOs, from our perspective, are a revolt on the traditional corporate form. They typically, or they have been taking the form of unincorporated associations and being treated like general partnerships. So there are a number of kind of legal issues that arise from that designation, including liability and fiduciary duties and things of that nature. The LCA is a modern take on the traditional co-op. And so kind of in how LCAs have been adapted in their flexibility, their principle-based approach to meeting the needs of organizers and groups. Really, you're seeing kind of the marriage between DAOs and LCA. So our theory and our kind of thesis that we're here to share with you today is that while there's still sort of no ideal legal form or structure for the DAO, we do think that the Colorado LCA statutes provide some of the kind of, as to what's out there, some of the best suited kind of regulatory environment and framework for what we're hoping to accomplish.
Right. So before we get on to the overlap, I think it's important to define what we're talking about, right? So cooperatives, they can be statutory business entities, and I'll touch on that. They can be a set of practices and values, and really a way of organizing and doing business that comes with a set of practices like shared decision making. It can be a set of basic principles. So it could be, and when we talk about cooperative, we expect to hear, and we hear about Rochdale principles, the 7 basic principles, or the Mondragon Principles, which is a little more expanded and based on its labor-centered set of principles. And as a statutory business entities, and taking the example of Colorado, where our firm is based, you're going to find Article 55 cooperatives. So that's a statute that is historically used by conventional cooperative industries, such as housing cooperatives and electric utility cooperatives. And this article is less and less utilized. Article 56 statute are cooperative corporations. So majority of the states throughout the country have adopted a similar statutory framework. And the majority of the non-tech cooperatives in Colorado still use this article to form their cooperatives. So the members then are given the opportunity to create their entity that fits their needs. Their bylaws can supersede most of the statutory governing characteristics. So, and then it's still allowing for investors to participate in the growth of the entity, but without voting power. And Article 58, that's the more recent addition to the suite of cooperative statutes in Colorado, and it's slightly different cooperative form. And it's known as the Limited Cooperative Association that Bill touched on, and that's the one we've been working with in the context of DAO cooperatives as well. That allows, as a form, it allows for non-patron investors to participate and have non-controlling rights to vote that the cooperative may or may not adopt if the members choose to do so. It has been object of criticism within the more traditional cooperative sectors because of the acceptance of investors and some level of not control, but voting rights to investors sometimes. So that's sometimes a hurdle in the more traditional sectors, but a benefit for some folks. And then, you're welcome to move along to the next. And again, that benefit of and flexibility when folks are looking for flexibility in their entity type, looking for outside of capital, they're innovating, they want a flexible entity type. That really, the simplest way and maybe more traditional way of explaining for those that are used to to corporations and to LLCs is that the LCA is a merger of those. It gives you the flexibility to typically find an LCA in an LLC model. And it's internally governed by a set of bylaws, but also allows some of the cooperative principles that we're also going to touch on again to be baked in that entity type. So startups are looking for LCA model because they are seeking outside capital and flexibility. DAOs, again, because of flexibility, but also because of the overlap of principles of decentralization, democratic participation of members, the democratic participation in the revenue and profits that are generated by the members, and that distribution that Bill touched on, that LCAs can benefit from, and therefore DAOs adopting that model. Next, please. So we can typify cooperatives by membership and by sector, and then I have a little bit of those there. So by membership classes, and for example, in a purchasing or shared cooperative services where members are all business or organizations who use the cooperative to more efficiently manage their operations, or they join or acquire access to bulk services. And we could say that employment commons reflects that model, where the cooperative functions as a group purchasing vehicle for benefits to their members, to be provided by the members. So I do want to highlight in that sense that that's one of the reasons why the employment commons have their members as entity types. That's a very important characteristic of a purchasing cooperative. Those are business organizations who use the cooperative in that sense. And then you can have types of cooperatives by sector. You can have a traditional one is the agricultural sector, but the tech sector can, it's growing through cooperative platforms, cooperatives that we're seeing. So folks using just Web 2 and now Web 3 to implement their processes or relationship within membership. And that could combine the classes of membership within their sector. So imagine a tech cooperative, a DAO co-op, a DAO LCA that has workers and consumers that both benefit differently from the cooperative. The workers by being able to own their portion or their membership and be a member owner as workers by providing the activity that we know as patronage activity to the cooperative, the DAO LCA, but also the consumers. So imagine a DAO that sells NFTs, and we're going to touch on an example later on, that can be also members, the folks that are purchasing that from the cooperative as well. There you go. We're back to a screen. And then I'm moving on to the cooperative principles. That will be the next one, the black screen. There you go. So quickly on that one, I just wanted to give you a visual of the basic Rochdale cooperative principles that were adopted in 1800s in Rochdale, England, and have formed the basis for principles that are adopted on which cooperatives around the world still operate today. So when we talk about cooperative principles overlapping with DAO principles, those are the principles we have in mind and have seen some of those reflected within the DAO practices and work. You have to want to move along, please. And then we can summarize legal characteristics of cooperatives in this way. One member, one vote. Typically, the LCA law also does allow member voting to be increased based on patronage activity, and I'll explain what that means. But essentially, allowing more, the more you interact with the cooperative, the more voting power you may have. So a little variation to one member, one vote. Business carried on for the mutual benefit of the members. That's an important characteristic. So the existence of the cooperative is to benefit the members in the cooperative, be them workers or consumers or purchasers. The profits are distributed to the members based on their patronage activity and not equity. So the members receive return back from the cooperative based on how much interactions they have with the cooperative and not how much money they put into the cooperative. And that's the defining characteristic of that patronage activity. So patronage, just simply, I guess, if I can ever put something simply, is just activity done by the members in relation to the co-op that results in generation of profits to the co-op. So if the cooperative is a consumer co-op, the cooperative's business is to sell something, and the consumer's activity is to buy that something. That is a patronage activity. Those businesses or the cooperative typically operate at cost. It doesn't mean that they don't generate profits, but it doesn't generate profits or surpluses to the entity itself. The goal in generating profits is, one, for the profits to be generated by the activity of the members, and two, that profit and surpluses that are generated from that activity be at some point distributed and for the benefit of the members. So you're going to hear patronage distributions, patronage dividend. Those are all names for that distribution of surpluses. Limited transfer of ownership is important. We've talked quite a bit about in the context of DAO with some of our clients. A member in a cooperative corporation cannot sell their membership interest in the cooperative if they decide no longer to be a member, either their membership is terminated or purchased back by the entity itself. You cannot just put that on secondary market or transfer that to another person that is not otherwise eligible for membership. And then I guess I'll just touch on limited liability for members. So members in engaging in the activities of the cooperative and or through the cooperative have protection in their assets, and that's something that our clients have sought heavily, and I think Bill touched on. It's important to protect the members' assets and the members from liabilities in the activity of the business, that entity, the business purpose, and adopting an LCA like other corporate models also protects them from that. And then I won't forget to mention securities exemption that exists. Yev might touch more on that, but just essentially, if you're a member, you're not investing in the co-op, you're purchasing your membership into the co-op, and any distributions that come from that, because coming from your engagement with the cooperative and not through the efforts of others, it's also that stock is exempt from securities registration. And then next.
Thank you. I apologize for all of the back and forth screens popping in and out, but so we've attempted to do somewhat of a scrape of the public information available on different kinds of DAOs. This is just a small snapshot of 2 that we chose from our list. And in sitting down and trying to design co-op DAOs, whether with new DAOs or with existing DAOs, these are some of the things that we're looking at, whether kind of what community, what industry the community is based on, the type of membership, whether they've issued a native token, how tokens are earned or collected, whether there's any kind of value, and whether that token has kind of bifurcated rights, whether governance or economic rights, the mechanism in which the DAO is operated, whether there's any kind of specific focus, and generally kind of the number of disclosed token holders or members. So it's important to look at some of these aspects in designing the co-op DAO, just because of some of the categories that Jackie touched upon earlier, and trying to figure out where the cooperative membership really rests in, and then kind of structuring governance based on that. So whether it's a producer cooperative, whether it's a service-based co-op, project-based, or multi-stakeholder, among all of the other ones that are listed. We're also big fans of Metagama Delta. They are a female-focused DAO that allow members to come together and vote on female-led projects. They are on Discord and are on the second version of the Moloch DAO. So just kind of in looking at existing DAOs and how they've naturally or organically come to be, we again look at membership, the type of activity, the type of members that are eligible, whether they have to have some kind of an active role or a passive role, whether they have to be a token holder to vote or participate in treasury activity. Also how the DAO makes money, that's pretty relevant in our analysis, and that it's not just kind of setting up a co-op and that kind of by purchasing membership or by purchasing tokens, that's generally not enough to create the patronage activity that we've been discussing. So it's really the interaction between the organization, the members, and the revenue generation which drive patronage activity, which Jackie will talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, so we wanted to highlight the patronage activity because I think that's one of the defining factors of or defining characteristics of a cooperative, right? So you have just generally in a stockholder economy, you have folks that put money into that business and expect that workers and the management and that the entity will produce revenue that will be distributed on this stakeholder, just generally stakeholder model that is a cooperative. The goal is really to have that interaction, the participation of the member, and by that participation generate revenue. So patronage is the concept that allows or that defines the members' participation. So it is an action of purchasing or selling, purchasing from or selling to, or otherwise engaging in the activity, the use of the goods or services provided by the cooperative for the members or for the benefit of the members. So REI is an example that's often brought. That's a consumer cooperative and has been brought up several times. It's a big entity with a lot of members and participants. As a consumer cooperative, it has a purpose, a business purpose of selling goods, and the patronage activity of the members is purchasing those goods, right? So when you buy there long enough for a certain amount of goods and services, you're gonna receive a return. So when you're engaging in that activity, the patronage activity, that's generating revenue for the business. The distribution you receive will be a patronage-based income or a patronage-based distribution. Your activity, your patronage activity, allow the entity or the business, that entity to generate some profits. After expenses, that surplus, what's left over, doesn't go to stockholders' pockets or to investors' pockets, but typically get distributed for the benefit of those that actually generated that revenue, that profit that resulted at the end. And then we have been encouraging our DAO clients to adopt, that have adopted the LCA model, to be really intentional about defining that patronage activity, because that comes with a specific tax treatment. It comes with securities expectations that it is not a security because formed in this way or profits generated in a certain way. So you're not investing there, you're engaging with activity. It generates profits, it gets distributed. All those expectations that come with it need to be to conform with the definition. So we've advised clients to be DAO clients to be very specific on those, because being on the Web3, on blockchain, and all that brings muddies the lines a little bit from selling goods or selling services as you typically expect cooperatives to do. And then adopting what we're calling patronage tokens, digital tokens tied to that activity that gets used to trace the patronage activity. So the same way that we can use POAPs to trace attendance on events, maybe using that as a unit of accounting to trace the patronage activity, and then therefore use that token itself to trace the returns as well, or use that as a measurement of accounting to return the distribution to the members later on. So patronage tokens, a token also that represents a membership that is separate from the patronage token. So if later on there are any questions, or the IRS or some other agencies are struggling to find out how to use that, well, we can explain that they have different uses, different purposes, and they make sense within that context, but also fit the legal needs or the legal frameworks that are already in place in these by cooperatives. So I did want to mention that, and that also becomes a way of facilitating vote based on patronage. Maybe you're tying your votes to your token itself, but your vote could be increased by the amount of patronage you do. And again, that can be done through the way you trace, by tracing your patronage activity, and again, using that measurement. So I wanted to touch briefly on a club I'm very excited, a DAO club I'm excited about, just because we just recently formed, the Sangha DAO Co-op LCA. That it was organized under Article 58. So it is a limited cooperative association, and their business purpose is essentially to eliminate the middleman, disrupt the music industry, and really have songs being heard as much as possible, and then distribute the profits and the royalties that are generated from that back to the members, whose patronage activity is really promote the listening of songs. So they will be purchasing Song a Day NFTs. They will be promoting the songs that come with the NFTs, and as the cooperative, the DAO, generates revenue royalties through that activity, they will be receiving returns from that. It will be governed by a board of stewards that is appointed at formation, and then but elected later on by the membership as the membership grows. And their goal is really to implementation of chain activity and not really to centralize decision making. So there are parameters that we put in place to make sure that once it reaches a certain number of members, it reduces any power that that entity, that board, can take, or any controlling actions that they might take to essentially overtake or overrun the entity. This entity will have two formal class of members and an informal membership participation through Discord voting, or not really voting, but participation there, and then two formal class of voting members. Again, returns will be made to those voting members based on their patronage activity. And this client went along with the recommendation and have adopted a specific membership token, and they will have the patronage token to trace the activity of the members, and then they will be purchasing from the cooperative NFTs that the cooperative will be selling.
And we just kind of wanted to summarize again on, Bill did a great job kind of talking about the philosophical aims and general overview of the employmentopolis and the employment commons, but kind of getting down to more of the granular legal aspects of how we help structure the commons. And really, they really pioneered the LCA DAO co-op structure or model in Colorado. We organized them under Article 58 as a public benefit limited cooperative association. So you can also kind of designate a specific public benefit in addition to the cooperative principles that we talked about earlier. We categorize them as a purchasing or shared services cooperative, and so far as they're able to share the services of benefits and payroll and these decentralized employment organization, other services that the Commons provides. And the Commons is an employment ecosystem which is designed to empower the self-sovereign worker, which I think is a pretty bold thing to do. It really shifts kind of power alignment, shifts power allocation to the worker and allows them to engage in this modern world in a very different way, whether it's with DAOs or other kind of traditional organizations, but it kind of being empowered to have benefits and being compliant, I think allows you to sort of have a lot of more bargaining power than you did previously as kind of a single worker. So through the Commons, employees receive W-2s. The structure is based on co-employment, and members can gain access, whether you're an employee member or a coalition member. You have rights to certain benefits that the Commons offers. The employee members gain access to healthcare and benefits and payroll. The bylaw, the Commons is governed by the Board of Stewards as well, and voting is based on quadratic voting, and we use a Gnosis multisig. But the bylaws does provide that there is a transition for decentralization on reaching a membership threshold of 1,000 members, and the bylaws can be adapted when such an event takes place, and kind of more dictated or realigned by the members. So the Commons does have a native work token, which is a unit of account that's used to determine patronage profits. And as they are declared by the Commons, they are unlocked by payroll mining and based on a formula called ACPV. And so again, kind of the general kind of woven piece here for all co-ops is that the members that are using and earning the work tokens are actually using the services provided by the commons. They're providing referrals, they're staking. It's not sort of just a passive membership, but it's rewarding people for taking part. And I think that's really what we've come to conclude as something that's very much shared with DAOs, and kind of creating these larger networks and having different kinds of member participation and reward systems built in that way. So that's us. And we are really, I mean, it's a really exciting time to be lawyering at the moment. And feel free to reach us at our email addresses or at our Twitter handles. It's been a pleasure presenting, and we will be releasing a paper as well on the topics that we presented today. So that's to come.
Great. Thanks, Jackie and Yev, really appreciate it. And Jackie and Yev will be available during our panel in about half an hour. So you'll see them there too. We'll see you again. So for the next speakers, we're excited to be joined by David Kerr and Miles Jennings, both of whom are very experienced and very talented lawyers. David is the founder of Cowrie LLC, and Miles is the general counsel for A16Z Crypto. Many of you may have read the amazing paper that David and Miles put out, I think it was just last week. I think the biggest legal paper drop I've ever seen in crypto world. If you haven't read it, highly recommend you check it out. You can find it via their Twitter, or we'll post a link to it at the DAOcollective.xyz. So there are David and Miles. Hey guys, we'll leave it to you.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, Connor. Thank you, ETHGlobal, Uniswap Grants Program, DAO Research Collective. Hope everyone out there is having a great hackathon. We appreciate you letting us drop in to talk to you. We're going to be talking about System of a DAO, a legal framework for DAOs, so not too dense, I hope. My name is David Kerr. I'm a tax attorney. I worked for Ernst & Young for a while there, the gaming and telecom sectors. And then when I left EY, I started a consulting practice to help with crypto issues. Well, first I took a little break, but then I started a consulting practice to help with crypto issues. And Miles approached me about the risks facing treasuries and some of the issues going on with DAOs. And so we ultimately prepared the memo that Connor was talking about. We didn't get here alone. There's a lot of people in the space doing really good work. I think every time, we start talking about tax, you got to reference David Shakur's 2016 article. It was awesome. Obviously, our memo has contributions from folks who helped us just a ton. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to my co-presenter, Miles. He's very boring, but he's very smart. So if you find the fortitude to stay awake, he's going to have some good stuff for you.
I don't think I buy into that description, but yeah, my name's Miles Jennings. I was a partner at Latham & Watkins until about 3 months ago. I had been there for 11 years in the emerging companies group, where I kind of specialized representing VCs and the companies that they invested in. I got started in the blockchain space in 2017, working with Consensus, basically trying to help them cool the market from going down the ICO craze and the SAFT craze. And so wrote a bunch about, those instruments and those offerings back then. And then from there kind of, got Paradigm as a client. I basically formed them and then have done did all of their deals for about 2 or 3 years. And then also brought in other, big VCs like Parify, Pantera, Dragonfly, Code2, Ribbit, and A16Z. And then I also worked with, a bunch of companies in the space, including Uniswap, Aave, Idle Finance, Element Finance, a bunch of DeFi protocols, and then starting to move into NFTs before I made the jump to A16Z about 3 months ago. So this problem of kind of what to do about DAOs really came up in the role of working with companies who are very frustrated by what the post token issuance world looked like, and so that was kind of the reason I enrolled Dave to help me out. So here's a quick disclaimer. Obviously, this is not legal advice. And we'd recommend speaking to an attorney, especially about the paper that we wrote if you do want to go down this path. Okay, so just starting out, like very basically from our perspective, right? There is no one size fits all, structure to use for DAOs, right? DAOs come in all forms of different shapes and sizes. When Dave and I first got started on this problem, we were really focused on DAOs that were formed in connection with DeFi protocols that had decentralized, right? So we were looking mostly at smart contract protocols, where your number of holders was into the thousands, tens of thousands, anonymous people on the blockchain, and ultimately that was kind of what the key focus is. Obviously, there are blockchain networks that use coin-based voting, and so I think there are some opportunities for this structure to be used with those DAOs. There are also social clubs, artist collectives, that has become that's really an emerging area of what use cases for DAOs are. I think those are the co-op structure obviously is very interesting, and I think that it really is going to depend on the facts and circumstances around kind of how transferable you want your tokens to be, whether you're for profit or not, right? That will ultimately be the deciding factors in terms of what structure you go for. And then there are also just investment clubs, and we're starting to see more and more of these where a group of people are basically coalescing around an investment structure and wanting to basically act collectively in making investments. So in that context, the legal issues that we were primarily focused on in dealing with these DAO problems, right, are securities laws, right? Everyone knows the Howey test in this space. There's also Landreth, which really looks at whether or not the instrument are shares. And in what that's really looking at, basically, it's a 5-factor test, but a lot of tokens would technically constitute shares or stock under this test if they were entitled to a distribution of profits, and so that is one of the other kind of areas where we've been focused on with respect to this structure. Legal existence is a concern, right? If you don't have any legal entity that you've formed, then what is common law going to stick you into? If it's a for-profit business, that often looks like a general partnership. If it's not a for-profit business, then it likely would be an unincorporated association, which is one of the nice things about the structure here, and that it's almost the default if you are structured properly. From a tax perspective, this is one of the leading factors in kind of what was driving this issue, right? Is a lot of DeFi protocols had started DAOs, had created treasuries with DAOs, and those treasuries were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, or millions of dollars, or billions of dollars. And as a result of that, there was obviously a strong desire to potentially diversify the treasury's assets. And the question then became, well, how do you pay taxes on that if there's no legal entity associated with it? Then there's liability. I think this is should be a significant concern for any founder or investor or DAO member in the space. Typically, general partnership liability looks at its can go to any single general partner. So it doesn't have to be shared equally. And as a result of that, any general partner that's identified could potentially be liable for any harm. Now, that probably wasn't, a very big concern when DAOs, especially for these DeFi protocols, were, just getting set up and there weren't any real world activities. You maybe had some proposals going on around like what collateralization ratios or what pools to open up, but, very, very unlikely set of harm there. Now that DAOs are growing, they're taking on real world operations. The need to bridge the virtual world and the digital, or in the real world, is becoming more and more important. And from a liability perspective, your assets and you live in the real world, and therefore not having kind of protection there for what you're doing in the virtual world is just taking along a lot of risk. Contracting, another area where, given, the operations of DAOs are expanding, you're seeing more of a need to actually have legal agreements in place with respect to service providers. So just for instance, right, there are, any number of proposals that have been up with respect to DeFi protocols where they've been, they've hired basically someone to provide a service to the DAO. But if you don't have a legal agreement there, then you don't really have any right to kind of demand that the person perform or that they actually meet their obligations. And as a result of that, we have seen a lot of DAOs struggle with actually the quality of the, work being done by service providers. Dave, do you want to speak more about the tax point?
Yeah, I'm just taking just a little bit of a step back because I know that our audience we're dealing with a really international community, and you've just heard 3 presentations that have hit on U.S. issues. So I'm going to get into it a little bit in this section on why the U.S. is kind of such an important part of the discussion, and then so hopefully that can kind of probably answer a question that I'm sure is blowing up the chat rooms right now. So one of the difficulties in discussing tax issues is that the rules are extremely complicated and can hinge on the slightest of details. When sufficient precedent exists, answers can be clean, but even then, they usually are caveated so much. Like when you've talked to a tax professional, that it's hard to understand. A lot of maybes, a lot of ifs, a lot of oh, don't quote me on that. And so what we're trying to do, I'm going to take a step back because decentralized governance is founded on consensus building and collaborative decision making. So I'm going to try my level best to drop the hedging, the disclaimers that added confusion, and just try to take as clean a line as possible through this. Which means I need you all to know that some of what I'm going to say is going to be simplified to the point of being oversimplified, even potentially wrong. But these are general ideas and conclusions and subject to much change depending on facts and circumstances. So you can't take these kind of high-level decisions and apply them to a company. But on the other hand, DAOs are made up of collectives of people who make decisions together. And so education's hugely important, and we're not going to start with that education by starting with the most technical answer and really nuanced issues. We kind of need to get into a little bit more of a general understanding of why some of these issues matter. So as to why US policy is so relevant on the DAOs, like one thing I hear a lot, especially since joining Twitter last week, is that DAOs are global. Their activity exists solely in an intangible form. And my favorite, you can't tax the internet, man, which is true. And those arguments do have merit. Some more than others, but one of the historically essential elements of taxation is nexus, which is taxable activity linked to a physical location. It's certainly difficult to attribute nexus to smart contracts and protocols, even online memberships and organizations. But when you introduce value, especially in the form of revenue, that changes a little. If Tim Berners-Lee and his colleagues at the CERN Institute had built a fee switch into HTML, I assure you, the history of the internet would be very different, and not at the very least from a tax perspective. International tax is hugely complicated, and the intersections of governments is a complex web of treaties, practice, application of their own laws, which vary greatly by jurisdiction, and how they intersect together. So taxation of online activity is often criticized as arbitrary, and the answer to that is that, yeah, you're right. Application of tax is pretty arbitrary. The decision to tax or not to tax, how to tax, when to tax, all stem from the government. And so it's a determination of what the government believes is going to be their tax policy. And to that point, governments are hugely impactful on the internet in general. It is easy to think of the internet as an ephemeral wonderland housing a digital world. But that is possible through fiber optic cables that run underground, across oceans, around mountains. The Wi-Fi we're using right now is ham radio connected to physical assets that exist in the real world. And the reality of that is the existence of internet activity must be assessed for possible tax implications when income is involved, especially when that income ultimately comes under the control of a taxable person or entity. Now, this part of the US focus right here is that the U.S. has a tax policy of worldwide taxation, wherever citizens are involved. We had a recent trend to territorial for purpose of, corporate, but more or less, when a U.S. citizen creates a U.S. company and that company develops a computer code, smart contract, or what have you, the arbitrary nature of the U.S. tax code makes income derived from that potentially taxable in the U.S. And if you're thinking, man, I'm sure glad I'm not a U.S. developer and not located in the U.S. and did not form a U.S. corp, then yeah, it's a different situation. It gives you different options. Our plan is set around a domestic entity structure for the U.S., but it certainly wouldn't be my first choice if I didn't have a lot of the factors in our decision for why the U.S. was right for who we picked to speak to as an audience. So from here on, when I do talk about tax, I mean U.S., and I'll clarify foreign treatment after that. Additionally, the liability protections that come from forming an entity, Miles is talking about liability protection. Well, when you form a U.S. entity, then all of the maybes go away, and you definitely have U.S. tax responsibility. So to kind of hit on the next slide, is it, Miles? The governance tokens, treasury activities, maybe it was it was the last one still. I saw them on the list. All right, so the ones that are on the list here, governance tokens, I'm not going to explain the mechanics of governance tokens to y'all. You know what it is. But the minimal guidance provided by the US does make governance tokens taxable as income when received and subject to capital gains when sold. Now that income sits in the hands of the holders of the governance tokens, and they have that responsibility. But a whole other section of that sits within the Treasury. And so there's a whole Treasury activity question that really comes down to who controls those tokens in the Treasury, how should they be taxed, who should be responsible for filing that tax, paying that tax, and where should it be paid. So, I'm not going to explain treasuries either. Again, it, except to say, like Miles did, some are worth a lot of money. And an application of US guidance on taxation of virtual currency could result in any number of situations where taxable events occur, including hard forks, treasury swaps, staking, founding of grant and lobbying programs. Who is responsible for that tax is not necessarily clear. The principles that define realization of income through dominion and control don't necessarily result in an obvious answer. But the choices are developers, the members, the entity, or the entity attributed back to the members. There's no one else. And if it's no one, that opens the door to its own set of problems regarding how a system was designed where that's possible. And so, long story short, interaction with certain protocols, can generate income, which needs to be recognized from a variety of sources. And I'm going to skip the deep dive into tax reporting because it could go on forever. And my soapbox that goes with it being an invasive privacy, and just say that the rules on how income and the transfer of money must be reported to the IRS. And this is true regardless of whether or not there's an entity exist across the board based on activities conducted in the US or other factors. And so in other words, US operations require everyone to have some form of reporting requirements. And so big picture, there are any number of ways that Dow and its treasury can realize taxable income in the US. And it's not creating a US entity that creates the obligation for that tax, but rather the creation of the entity that is the solution, which creates a mechanism to pay the existing tax. And this was the problem Miles and I originally set out to solve. And hopefully the rest of this presentation kind of takes you through. So back to you, Miles.
Yep, thanks. So just looking at kind of what goes on in the world currently with the vast majority of DeFi protocols and DAOs is really you have one of kind of two like general structures, right? There's the entity list structure, and then there's use of a foreign foundation. So the reason that those are the kind of the two routes is that there's no simple answer on the entity structure. Or at least, there hasn't been, right? And so you can't use a C Corp, right? Otherwise your DAO members are stockholders. Obviously there are securities laws issues that come up as a result of that. LLCs don't really work. Membership interests are also, securities. And so, you would only be able to use accredited investors in that situation. The Wyoming DAO bill is great, but really it is meant for a scenario where your DAO members are all going to be accredited investors. None of them are going to be anonymous. And really, that kind of takes it out of a lot of DAOs, right? Anonymity is basically a killer for use of that type of legal structure. Partnerships, again, are not great, for various reasons, including the limitation of liability point that we discussed earlier. And then obviously we've heard, co-ops might be a viable solution for many DAOs. So looking at the entity list and foreign foundation structure, right? Really what those look like is, and I'm just referring to the case of where you have a, let's say US Delaware C Corp who has started a company and now in the process of decentralizing, they're going to issue tokens and, basically turn over control of the smart contracts to, the governance protocol, or, even just like a social DAO that starts out by issuing tokens to individuals that want to be part of it, and then they hold events, right? So all of those really are just relying on the fact that, they don't really know what entity structure to use. And so they've deposited governance tokens into a smart contract, which is the treasury. And then those tokens are controlled by the governance mechanism that's put in place. I think the risk there is obviously what we were just talking about with respect to the general partnership structure and, limitations on liability, potential tax issues, all sorts of stuff. The foreign foundation solves some of those problems, right? And the foreign foundation is really, what companies will do is they'll create a foundation in a foreign jurisdiction, usually a tax favorable one. and they'll have the treasury, basically allocated to that foundation. And usually the DAO can give instructions to the foundation. Some of the issues there, right, is that you haven't wrapped the DAO in a liability shield, right? The DAO basically controls the foundation, but to the extent that they engage in anything else, right, they could be found to be liable. The tax problem is probably the one that is best solved here, because it does create an entity that can pay taxes. However, there is significant risk in terms of offshoring, U.S. assets to foreign jurisdictions, and basically the process that you have to go through for that. The U.S. typically doesn't like people to move out assets outside its jurisdiction, so they do have some checks there. So as a result of all of that, that really leads to the unincorporated nonprofit association. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so we did a pretty thorough scrub of what options were available. Miles kind of talked you through some of the ones. I mean, there's other ones on the list that work depending on situation. One thing to keep in mind that Miles already hit on is that so many different types of DAOs, you're going to get different facts and circumstances. But one that really opened up the door was the unincorporated nonprofit association. And so, at a real high level, we've got the UNA is kind of a registered unincorporated association that carries various statutory protections through different states. There's a uniform act, the UNA, where the UNA rules have been kind of defined, and the states have their own right to kind of make adjustments to them. But overall, it looks like a relatively strong or better than strong fit in most regards, based off of just kind of the type of nature of what DAOs operate as and associations. They're a little less formal than corporated structures. The membership makes a lot more sense. And I'll get into that detail in a little bit. But one thing to keep in mind is that legal entity and tax entity are interwoven, but separate concepts. When Miles was talking about the entity forms that give rise to limited liability, the ability to contract, the ability to have a bank account, the ability to pay taxes. But when the U.S. legal entity is forms, it creates a tax entity that's kind of separate but different with how it interacts together. Some entities are defined as corporate. The entities tax directly or pass through, like with partnerships where profits are passed to members and taxed directly to them. In the past 75 years, significant blurring between incorporated entities and unincorporated entities has occurred. As the protections of incorporation stemming from legal existence as a distinct entity have been given to unincorporated forms, the history of the corporation, it's been a change. And the history of the corporation is really interesting. And you can trace it from Rome to England to the US. But the reality is the modern form is just an entirely different meaning than the historical, because state jurisdictions have passed laws giving similar and at times identical treatment to entity forms that historically would have been completely separate and how they were treated. So, LLC, LLP, LLLP, unincorporated nonprofit associations, S corps. And so in the 1990s, the IRS said, what, we're done dealing with this. They gave up on forcing the historical treatment for tax purposes, and they introduced the ability for many entities to select between corporate and pass-through taxation for, based off of their preference. You file a form 8832, and it's a de facto election pro forma, and that's the solution that the IRS had, rather than trying to chase the historical definition through. What we suggest in the paper is that the UNA select a C corp. So in the case of an UNA doing so, it provides a lot of benefits, even though it introduces the concept of double taxation. UNA's taxable C corp would be able to pay taxes on behalf of its members and would solve many of the practical limitations related to partnership taxation, withholding requirements, K1 reporting, identifying partnership share for the treasury, which they do not have access to or really exercise dominion control over. The difficulties in DAOs meeting flow through taxation reporting. But really, I think the difficulty stems, with DAOs report. You hear a lot that DAOs can't meet partnership filing requirements. I think that's more to do with the failure and them being a partnership and acting as a partnership than any failure on their part to actually meet an existing obligation. The UNA provides a kind of a more philosophically appropriate place for them and wouldn't carry the same reporting requirements that they can't meet based off of that organization. Corporate taxation is also characterized a lot of times is unfair to foreign members who might end up paying more tax under the structure. It's a little more complicated than that. The activity being taxed at the corporate level wouldn't have a clean path back to the foreign holders under a flow-through structure, at least as it relates to the Treasury, which is by far the most significant tax liability for DAOs at this time. Hypothetically, member distributions of profit could result in unequal treatment for foreign members, but as Miles was saying to the securities piece, direct member profit distribution is something to be avoided. So, taxation of C Corp does introduce double taxation, which means the entity will pay tax and distributions to the members will also be taxed. But it does clean up a lot of the tax filing requirements, the tax reporting requirements, and kind of has an ease of administration use too, because you've got one entity paying tax instead of passing all the information necessary for everyone who has anything to do with it, having that information passed to them and decided what was theirs based off of apportionment calculation that they didn't have a say in, which is exactly ideal decentralization principle. So.
Right. So just quickly through the advantages of what the UNA affords, right? So it's very simple formation requirements, right? You could look back and for companies that have already kind of launched their DAO, right? You could look back and say that when that governance structure was first launched, that was really the formation of the UNA. As Dave was saying, there are lots of states that would require you to register your UNA in order to get liability protection. So there's no kind of in those states, there's no going back and kind of fixing that. But again, you would be able to kind of get it going forward if you were able to register and were really qualified. Then there's also flexible government, right? There's no need for a board. There's no need for like a centralized hierarchy of kind of control, which is obviously beneficial because it combats against the centralization analysis that would technically lead to interest in the DAO being deemed to be securities under the Howey test. They're scalable. There's no membership limits. You can any number of people can be members. They're also transferable, and although the UUNAA indicates that they shouldn't be transferable, it does give power to the UNAs to determine whether or not they should be transferable. So if you were to adopt a articles of association that essentially allowed for transferability, then that should be the controlling factor. And then it provides limited liability, right? So Dave talked about the tax piece. The limited liability is the other kind of big piece in our mind, where it will give DAOs and DAO members a lot more freedom to operate and actually engage in potentially real world activities that would otherwise lead to potential liability. And so I think from that perspective, we do think that these kind of features, right, really probably are most in line with what I think people's expectations of DAOs, right? That there's no centralized hierarchy, that you do get limitation of liability, that there is reasonable taxes being paid. All of that stuff kind of fits in within like how DAOs currently work. And so as a result of it should be a fairly painless kind of entity structure to layer into these DAOs that won't really change their operation. Dave?
Yeah. And so this is really kind of one of the tricky parts in trying to explain this to people, is that immediately kicks back to like, how on earth can a governance token, a DAO, where everyone's trying to make money, be nonprofit status? And it's really a matter of terminology more than anything. We have the slides here, but I'll just kind of talk you through it. People usually associate nonprofit with charity. That's not necessarily the case. Many DAOs are not established for a profit purpose. And although the mechanization of governance varies by protocol, in general, the primary functionality of a governance protocol is not to make profit, but to create and vote on governance proposals that control the smart contracts of an underlying protocol and direct the actions of the DAO treasury to foster the development and growth of decentralized ecosystems. And so governance tokens are digital assets that represent voting power within a DAO and integral to decentralization because they distribute powers and rights to users. And so the governance tokens themselves obviously have huge valuations on the market right now, but that's not necessarily determinative of a for-profit status, right? The example that we've utilized a lot to just kind of convey this is homeowners associations. You know, you live in a homeowners association, you have all these rules, your covenants, and you're protecting your property. And just because the house value goes up in the community that you live in, and obviously profit from that going up, doesn't mean that your homeowner association's a for-profit entity. The values of the governance tokens are not an indication the DAO itself is for profit. The outside market may or not be because of their actions. And it really wouldn't matter if it weren't, because the underlying activity within it is what we're analyzing to see if it's appropriate or not. And a big part of that is because the people who hold the governance tokens, whether it's the treasury is paying a ton of tax on it, or the members are paying a ton of tax on it. That's already been removed is tax. What's left is what's not the governance tokens is really what we're talking about. And that sits within the DAO, the protocol itself, the smart contracts. And so it's kind of a bit of distinction, but it's an important one. So really the question is whether this definition of nonprofit that we're utilizing is able to qualify as a nonprofit under the law, and that depends on state. You know, there are 10 jurisdictions that have adopted the Uniform Unincorporated Nonprofit Association Act, where the activities of most DAOs would meet these requirements without any charitable purpose whatsoever. And in the states that do have a charitable purpose, there's pretty good statutory authority for them supporting other states having the ability to decide for themselves what should be and should not be nonprofit for the purpose of UNUNO.
Yeah. And I like California is just a good example there, right? Where, California actually does allow their UNOs to engage in for-profit activity, so long as, anything that is lawfully allowed to engage in. So, as a result, there are states that certainly provide a more flexible framework for, UNOs to operate. And as a result of that, there's kind of significant opportunity to, apply these structures to DAOs and to wrap them. I think that takes us to our last slide. We're a bit over time here, so we'll just be quick. But Dave and I are going to work on preparing a kind of practical applications and stuff like that to give more information to the community. And we're working with a couple companies on that front. Again, no one size fits all approach. This structure can also be kind of combined with other structures such as trusts, the foreign foundation. There's just a whole bunch of different ways where you can actually incorporate this. And there's, a bunch of activities that you could engage in to, kind of deal with, trying to basically be a responsible actor in the corporate world, right? So in terms of capitalizing the business, doing things like that we'll, be following up on this paper with more information on. Anything else, Dave?
No, I'm good. Thanks for having us. I guess we're about to do a panel, so we're not going anywhere. We're adding people.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Much appreciated. And you're totally right. We are about to add more speakers. So Yev and Bill and Jacqueline, if you want to just turn your videos on, you'll now become part of the broader panel. So we're going to start on a panel really so we can jam and dive a little bit deeper on what Miles, what really everyone who's spoken so far has gone into as it relates to unique structuring in the space. Bill, of course, is taking this from a little bit of a different angle with Opolis, but at the same time, I'm sure you have a lot of information about what you're seeing from the DAOs that you guys are working with. And I'd be really interested, particularly as it relates to the liability pieces and how workers, but then also the DAOs themselves are seeing that. And Jackie, whenever you want, you can also just turn on your video and you can join us too. So I know that there might end up being a little bit of overlap between what you guys discussed in your presentation and some of these questions, but I'll get started and we'll see where the conversation takes us. I'll just suggest some people respond to particular questions, but anyone should definitely feel free to jump in, particularly if they feel strongly about anything that's coming up here. So first question, I'm going to put this one to David first, but then anyone else feel free to jump in. When you work with DAO founders and operators, what do you think are their biggest legal risks? And how does that differ from what they think are their biggest legal risks? And this is something, I throw this in there, it's almost out of personal interest in a way, because we see so many misconceptions on Twitter about like what are risks from a legal front, what people can do. There's just a ton of unknowns among crypto folk who really don't have access to lawyers or a lot of very good information at the moment. So really interested to see what you guys are seeing from them, but then also what you perceive to be the biggest problem. So we'll start with David and we'll move on from there.
Yeah, and just to kind of leave room for everyone else, just I'll just keep mine confined to the tax space. Not filing a return is, and whether or not a return should be filed is obviously huge for clients who think that there's a possibility that they may be on the wrong side of some decision making or the kind of future events, and so there's a lot of concern over that. And you know what, that'd be mine too, if that's the situation. But there's two other ones that are a little kind of less. Tax reporting did not get a whole lot of attention until the infrastructure bill, would be my perception of it. It had been kind of heating up before that. But there's a lot of tricky rules. And they're tricky if you're trying to follow them, and there's still a lot of penalty. If you're just willfully not following them, the penalties are punitive because the government does not want people not filing. And those forms exist whether you're foreign situated or domestic situated. And so I think, especially with the infrastructure bill as proposed, could be really serious. And then kind of a surprising one is the risk of perception. On the political stage, these issues are often trivialized as tax evasion, money laundering, but the reality is the technology is new and it provides a lot of benefit over existing process. And so the difficulties in reporting are a result of that, not an intent to aid in harmful behavior. And so education on why the difficulties exist is key, because the change of the law or the benefits of change of law is going to be the difference maker. So if the government reacts and there's a harsh reaction to this idea of like money laundering, tax evasion, which is well deserved in a lot of industries. You look at the Panama Papers, and you start kind of getting into tax evasion. It's not that people in the U.S. don't commit tax evasion. It's just that this isn't necessarily the best vehicle for it. And getting that distinction communicated, explaining why that's true, is going to be hugely influential in keeping this next round from being, we're all worried about the new laws that are terrible. We want the new laws to be better, additive, and helpful. And so that'd be my take.
Yeah, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my kind of flags back up against taxes as well, but I'm by no means a tax professional, but just kind of surrounding, paying workers with tokens and imputing value to those tokens, how you're declaring those, bringing on employees into DAOs, whether you're treating them as independent contractors or you're classifying them as employees, and all of the issues that surround that. Licensing is a big one as well, and who holds the IP, who holds the rights, and yeah, I mean, liability, obviously, which is something that we've been talking about across all three presentations. It's just not having any kind of legal wrapper and sort of the consequences that entail as to all of the members participating. And it can be pretty scary. I think it's probably, we're saying these things in kind of default treatment as general partners, but I mean, if somebody sues one person and then they can go and claim against the others for some large amounts of money, I mean, you can be wiped out financially pretty significantly. So that's a huge concern. So just trying to shield yourself from liability, shield the organization from liability. I think that would probably be number one.
Yeah, I mean, I think
quick fault. Sorry, go ahead, Mas.
I was just going to say, so I think one of the situation that we find ourselves in, right, is like people look at, Bitcoin and Ethereum, and, they obviously don't have a legal entity that kind of wraps the decision-making framework, or, you have like, and Bitcoin is mined and no one is paying tax on like the issuance of that Bitcoin through those mining operations. Obviously the miners themselves pay tax on the Bitcoin they receive, but like the kind of the way that those structures work, same thing with Ethereum, right, is you basically had these, unwrapped kind of decision-making frameworks. The problem with where we've shifted from that area to, governance token based DAOs, right, is that all of a sudden you now really do have people that are responsible for deciding the direction of where these allocation of assets go. right? And as a result of that, and they're undertaking activities on behalf of, other members. So as a result of all of that, all of these legal issues have popped up where it's like, these are not directly comparable to, Ethereum and Bitcoin and that, right? These are more complex systems. And, there's more of a bridging of virtual reality and actual reality. And as a result of that, like, legal frameworks need to be put in place to protect people in the real world.
And do you think like part of that implication is that now that DAOs have really exploded over the last, 8 months, maybe, people in the crypto space are just not ready, or they're not prepared in any way, or have very little touch points for these unique problems? Like, for instance, the general partnership thing that Yev mentioned, that probably wasn't on the radar of many people in crypto who don't have, some level of legal background at this point. So it seems like it's almost a new issue for the community.
I mean, to jump in here, I think the issues that the crypto community are facing are in many ways the same ones that a lot of startup founders face. When I was a lawyer back in the day, crypto wasn't as big. I mostly advised startup founders on technology agreements and general corporate stuff, and often they had no context for what was a general partnership, or the question of whether and when to incorporate came up all the time. So I don't think these are new issues. I think the challenges are in trying to maintain the Web3 ethos, how you address those issues, because a traditional C Corp with kind of like your 3 founders owning everything and then taking outside investment really isn't what a lot of people in Web3 are after. And so it's trying to kind of fit a new paradigm in terms of how you organize a project and how you build together into this legal system that was formed with the idea that kind of the contributors to projects and companies would be well defined, that they might be in a single jurisdiction even, rather than spread out across the world, with some of them being anonymous. And that's where I think we're bumping up against kind of some of the trouble and encountering these more unique questions in the legal space. I think some of the growing pains are really the growing pains you see in any kind of startup environment. It's just the answers are so much more complex with DAOs and DAO workers.
And it's also so, the DAOs themselves are evolving so rapidly that some of these issues, for instance, if you were just creating a DAO for a DeFi protocol that had the treasury automatically set up for, yield farming, and there was no actual voting, right, then I don't know that you would need to go down the route of dealing with all of these problems, right? But it's as you add on complexity in what the DAO is doing, the legal issues get more complex, and that's why kind of we find ourselves where we do now.
Yeah, and that's where kind of my spicier take is. There are situations where it's appropriate to kind of choose the YOLO entity form.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of situations where probably an unincorporated nonprofit or a cooperative or even an LLC makes sense. It's all about context and what you're trying to accomplish, right? I think, as a former lawyer or a recovering one, I'm sensitive to over lawyering, and I think too many people who are trying to like create these little project-based DAOs or social clubs are thinking about entity structures and all of that. And it's like, well, when you and your friends get together and pool like $100 to, buy tickets to some sports event, do you form a legal entity for that? Do you kind of create a bunch of legal contracts to make sure that everything's enforceable? Or do you just kind of like do it and use social context to enforce kind of the promises that people are making? And I think that's probably appropriate for a lot of DAOs, versus if you are kind of creating a DeFi protocol where you're about to accumulate a ton of wealth in a shared treasury, it's worth kind of like talking to lawyers and thinking pretty deeply about how to structure yourself.
Yep.
But Bill, I guess, and to your point on kind of like the legal structure, now that's part of, I think, advising, or that touch point with the attorney should also be always like, let's not drive with the type of legal entity, right? Sometimes we're going to have folks coming to us and say, hey, I want a cooperative, or I want to form an LLC, without having defined what they're doing, how their members interact among themselves, what's their kind of almost like their business plan, or how they relate to each other. And then they want to fit how they have been doing some of that interactions into a square that is what the law says upfront, without having decided on a bunch of other things that are either logistics or just relates to the success of their venture, or the feasibility of that, which is really more important. Like, we can find out legal ways, and if not, we can work around, but after kind of having defined on that. And that's super important, I think, to remember. It's like, there isn't one perfect legal entity right now, I don't think. There are some that are better than others for specific aspects. So kind of like not driving with that is also, I think, very valuable.
I think also it's worth not losing perspective that we have some of the most powerful centralized entities in the existence of the world, creating the structures that we have to operate within. And so it's not particularly surprising that a decentralized structure is going to have problems onboarding into what is the extremely centralized system. And so I think the reality of the situation is, I think we're going to have to take some of these pain points on if we want them to change. We're going to have to kind of dig in on some of these issues. Otherwise, we're just going to accept a reintroduction of a centralized principle somewhere down the line.
Yeah. I do think, to your point, David, there is room for a certain level of almost like civil disobedience in choosing no legal structure for certain DAOs that are truly decentralized. Again, this is where I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have to give clients legal advice. But if we really want to push regulators forward and kind of push them to recognize that at a certain point, transparency is accomplished through this technology, and at a certain point, decentralization means you're not so much relying on the efforts of some small cohort of people with specialized information or specialized skills, but part of a community. Maybe we don't try and force the square peg into the round hole. Maybe we kind of throw our hands up to the regulators and say, like, look, we're not going to participate in the system right now until you give us a form that fits our ethos. I think there's a lot of risk to that, but it
certainly doesn't work on the tax side, right? I don't think.
Hasn't not worked yet, though, but also not legal.
Yeah, and that's also where with Opolis we kind of encourage the contributors to LLC and S Corp themselves and pay taxes on their income, because as an individual, you do not want to ignore your tax.
So do you have them do that? Do you have them do that for every DAO they're in then? So do they form a different LLC for each?
No, they can funnel all the different DAO incomes and through the same LLC. So it's kind of like a traditional freelancer model where, you bundle all of your income, you run it through your company that's like Bill Inc., and then you take out the appropriate amount of taxes on that income and pay it to the government.
And then they become an employee member of the Commons by virtue of that LLC. So they've got kind of mass worker power across everywhere else, except that they're co-employed by the Commons.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, I feel like this is something that we always get into when we talk about legal structuring for DAOs and crypto, or maybe just lawyering generally for DAOs and crypto, is to what extent we need to focus on existing structures and to what extent we need to work to advocate. But it's very frustrating, of course, for founders who just come to talk to you and you tell them, oh, this needs to change, but we have no timeline for it changing. And in the in-between period, you need to work in this very gray area. And here are some structures, for instance, the ones you guys are recommending that could work, but they also need, we're at early stages in many ways of exploring them. So maybe before we jump into the advocacy stuff, like if we could dive into maybe if Miles and Dave, if you want to go first, and then Yev and Jackie, the biggest sort of challenges and whether a founder today could connect with a lawyer and start working on the structures that you're proposing. Yeah,
I think that the biggest hurdle that we see, obviously we listed in the disadvantages, right, was around kind of the nonprofit like angle, and basically, you want to ensure that your structure is going to basically be able to meet what that means in the state that you're registering. But I think one of the key pieces I think that still needs to be done on ours is to really look at a 50 state survey of which states have the best UNA statutes, and then taking that and actually working with lawyers in that jurisdiction to ensure that the way that you mean nonprofit is in line with what they mean as nonprofit. And then the other kind of piece there, right, is there's a whole bunch of federal laws that could potentially create issues. One of the problems with DAOs having treasuries, right, is under the Investment Company Act, if over 40% of your assets are, potentially securities, then you could be deemed to be an investment company, which requires registration under the 40 Act, which is obviously a big pain in the ass and not something that any DAO would really be able to do, other than like small investment DAOs. And so, as a result of that, right, the gray area around, whether or not a token is a security also screws you with respect to Investment Company Act stuff. And so and then there's, money transmitter, there's just a whole host of kind of federal issues that, are already applicable to DAOs. But, once you put a regulatory structure or an entity in place, you also have to jump those hurdles. So there are things to kind of work out, and we at Andreessen just proposed, to Senator Toomey some legislation that would have created a federal entity that was could be labeled a DAO to provide for tax payment, and then also carves out from the the BSA and the ICA DAOs that are that are operating on blockchains. And so I think that there's still a ways to go in terms of nailing it down so that you are eliminating all risk. But I think that any way you slice it, putting a legal entity in place, if you have the resources to do so, is a step in the right direction, just because of the liability and the tax potential.
I'll do a much briefer one than Miles. I think, the only thing to tack on is, form over substance, right? The laws exist. I think there's a chance for us to, or substance over form in the positive statement of it. I think there's enough room in the law for us to find substance for our article, for, what we described in the article. What we would like to see is a little bit of clarification of what kind of nonprofit would and would not be activity would not be counted for purposes of in our case the UNA, but really all of these laws. Because if there's clarification, there's less ambiguity. It's just faster. So if the state governments could, update their definitions that were constructed well before they conceived of any of these ideas, and say, okay, well, this one fits in this bucket, this one fits in that bucket, then a lot of this ambiguity where we just kind of hash over, we don't really know if it's going to be in this one or that one, could be solved. And so just clarification of the rules, not necessarily even a change, just clarification of terminology, so we know what the answer is.
Yeah.
I would say that the kind of in following our thesis and the conclusion that we're trying to purport in going with the Limited Cooperative Act for housing the DAO. I mean, the ULCA has been around since 2007. I think Jackie will kind of check me on that, but and it's it does come up against some of the same issues in terms of reciprocity and recognition across state lines and state boundaries. But I do, Jackie, do you know the number of states that have adopted the ULCA?
There's 7 jurisdictions, or 8 jurisdictions with 7 states, so the District of Columbia included, the 8th since 2008 adoption. So you're right on 7. And then the last one being adopted, I think 2019 in Washington.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a little bit more history there, and just kind of, I think what we're seeing most is people coming to us and thinking that they have a automatic securities exemption, and while that is true on some level, that's certainly not what kind of our philosophy is in using the co-op structure to house DAOs. So there are state securities laws that exempt membership interest and patronage as securities, and then also on the federal side, the Foreman Test, which basically states is similar in many ways to the Howey test, but essentially states that there has to be a limitation on transferability. It's based on kind of membership, patronage, and activity. You have to have that kind of principle of democratic participation and voting that's tied to that exemption. And I think, Jackie, did I miss any? Yeah, it's one member, one vote, and then there's restrictions on transfer. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely there is definitely this unique kind of halo effect around the co-op from that perspective, especially given all of the instability on the security side with crypto, and we've been bombarded with that question. But really, we're still sort of very much wedded to the cooperative principles and having kind of that philosophical aim achieved with setting up a DAO in a co-op structure. So you have to have some kind of utility. You've got to have participation. You've got to have that network effect built into your bylaws and your structure in order for that to be a good fit. So, Jackie, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
It makes me think more. On the other side of the coin is that the DAOs, we have these issues sometimes with folks that want to start a cooperative, that there are two founders and they want to start a cooperative, and they have that founder mentality that's mine, I own it. And then so typically there's a mindset shift that happens when you have three of those, because it's more collaborative. There's some research around that. So when you're thinking about DAOs, it is typically already a bigger group of people. They have been collaborating. So the mindset shift has taken place already, makes them more ripe too. So there are all those issues that we have and challenges that we have to address, but are also, as far as they are in a mental space and a practical space that is already kind of ripe for that collaboration and just kind of calls for more collaborative types. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're both talking cooperatives and nonprofit that are typically membership-based entities as well. That kind of makes sense, because those are type of legal entities that have required, to some extent, taking a step back from that founder mentality to like kind of collaborative approach as well. So that's, for me, the other side of the coin, with a challenge that gets eliminated.
And maybe starting with Bill in this next one and dovetailing on that a little bit. So thinking about the nonprofit structure, the cooperative structure, it does seem relatively consistent in some ways with what we've seen from or what we're currently seeing from DAOs. And we'd love to know whether you're finding that your clients are more receptive to these two different sorts of structures, or there's folks you're talking to generally because of the history, or if they don't care. And like a second part of that question is, are there communities receptive to it? Because I know that there'll be, to some extent, particularly if larger DAOs are going to choose one of these structures to the extent they can at a later stage, there'll need to be some community agreement that some consensus there. And I imagine there'll have to be a vote as well. So maybe we can start with Bill on this one. And you don't work directly on this piece necessarily, but certainly I'm sure that working with DAOs and bringing the co-op structure to bear, you've had experience, but then I would love to hear from everyone else.
Yeah, so before I joined Opolis, I was building DAO platforms targeted towards nonprofits and social goods, because early in my career, I'd worked on kind of the dirtiest form of nonprofit, which is the 527 or 501c4 nonprofit. Which are social advocacy groups or political organizations. And in a lot of ways, those seemed ripe for DAOification. It turns out, though, when you go to existing nonprofits and say, hey, do you want to decentralize and start giving more decision-making authority to your membership? They're like, no. But I do think within the Web3 community, we've seen this kind of ethos of collaboration and cooperation and decentralization. So have done a lot of work with kind of crypto for good communities that are very interested in exploring nonprofit forms. Not necessarily 501c3s, which confers obviously the advantage of being tax exempt, plus having contributions be tax deductible, but 501c4s and 527 organizations that are looking to influence politics but operate as a DAO in order to be flatter and more decentralized. I think crypto people are interested and willing to accept that. There's just still this level of intimidation and kind of, I guess, some recoil against kind of participating in the system that seems so broken, especially once you talk about like, well, this entity form was really utilized first effectively by dark money groups, but it actually could be utilized for a DAO for good in a much more transparent way. So I do hope that we'll see more and more of that. On the Acropolis side, because we're focused more on value accrual and then redistribution of that value to our membership, the cooperative made more sense than a non-profit kind of structure, because like, I forget whether it was Jackie or Yev used the REI example, right? People who are a member of our cooperative pay a fee in order to support the services that we provide, which is payroll processing and finding benefits and administering all of that. And the hope is that as we grow and scale and those fees kind of outstrip the operational expenses, that we can start returning those to members in order to offset the fees that members are paying to us. And maybe even someday that patronage will exceed the fees that members are paying in, though I think that's a long way off. And that creates kind of an opportunity for all of these stakeholders to really benefit from membership in the cooperative, and for us to distribute value across these different classes of contributors that do range from people that just process payroll to people who refer members into the cooperative and help us grow, to technology providers. And what interests me there, and what I think a lot of DAOs should think about when considering the cooperative model, is it is good for kind of stakeholder economies and kind of this post-capitalist sort of value accrual and distribution across stakeholders, rather than focusing on shareholder primacy. So, I'm trying to be very careful in the way I talk about it, because as Yev knows, the securities laws are a concern with the cooperative structure, right? Our members aren't just limited to Colorado. So while the Colorado securities exemptions are amazing, and Colorado is hopefully blazing a path for other regulators to copy, right? We're subject to federal oversight because our tokens and our membership crosses state lines. But, I do think while we're stretching some areas of traditional co-op law with tokenizing patronage, we're also sticking pretty close to it, in that everybody who receives patronage tokens is providing value. And as we grow and can put more and more stuff on chain, I think we're also trying to, accomplish the core goal of the securities laws regimes in this country, which is really disclosure and information sharing, right? The SEC isn't really supposed to do kind of like merit-based securities calls, right? Unlike some states where they can kind of say like, we don't like you, you can't issue a security. The SEC is very focused on disclosure. You don't have to be a good company, but you do have to be a good discloser. And I think that's kind of the hope for blockchain and DAOs in my mind, is to say, like, on a philosophical level, by putting this stuff on chain, we are creating a level playing field in terms of what people can see is going on. And there isn't this information asymmetry that created the need for a disclosure regime, because everybody can see what's going on, everybody can participate. So, while we're playing it a little bit safer with the cooperative structure, I do hope that the cooperative structure can serve more as a guide for regulators as they're considering kind of a new way to regulate tokens and DAOs.
I'll just add that we do also have the Colorado Digital Token Act, which Bill mentioned kind of from the state securities perspective, is I don't know how powerful it is, but it is there, and it does provide some guidance on differentiating between utility and security tokens. So
I also think we're going to get, I think we're probably going to have more luck at the state level trying to get adjustments to laws to enable DAOs to operate and securities laws changes, right, than at the federal level, where it's looks like it's going to be very difficult to change anything with respect to that analysis.
Maybe let's kind of jump on that thread a little bit as it relates to the advocacy piece and what it is that state and federal regulators and policymakers need to do, or what we should help try to encourage them to do to provide clarity for founders, allow for this industry to thrive in the United States, maybe to capture some of the tax dollars that are so available to them if they so choose to allow it. And so one thing that we did at the DAO Research Collective, we hosted an event in June, and we used that event to get a sense of the biggest problems faced by DAOs, and then also scheduled a number of different interviews with a lot of stakeholders in the space to figure out what their biggest issues were. And their biggest issues always ended up being things that we just couldn't help them with, or probably no one could really help them with, that it required change, the change in policy or change of regulation before they get the clarity that they'd want to see. So we appreciated that this is actually one of the biggest issues that DAOs as a group should be focusing on, is advocacy, because it's what they need in many ways, depending on the type of DAO, of course, but to get that clarity that everyone seems to want as it relates to like hiring workers, limiting liability, a securities piece, and any number of different things that we discussed today. So maybe starting with you, Miles, because I know that ACCZ has done a lot of work on this front. Like, what do you, what do you see as the most important piece to advocate for? What do you see as a strategy or direction forward for crypto as it relates to the advocacy piece, and who needs to be involved in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was nice to see during the infrastructure bill process how kind of it seems like the industry really woke up and really started kind of taking the lobbying part of this seriously. And I think that that's really important, because I think as Web3, as that becomes into view and more clearly for people, there are going to be more intermediaries out there, businesses that are going to be pushing back on kind of what decentralization and all of that allows. And so I think that there is really going to be, a strong kind of fight on that basis. I think at the moment, I guess, two issues that I'm most focused on, right, are really around, just DAOs and how they can operate and be legal and exist. And then, what tax implication and reporting obligations are. I think that there's very much a desire, at the federal government level, and we saw this in the infrastructure bill, to apply laws to, blockchain protocols and networks, as though, that like basically recreating intermediaries within those systems when there aren't, which obviously destroys the value of the technology. And so I think that kind of trying to. And then on the DAO side, right, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty. People, you talk to people in government about DAOs and they don't understand, and they're like scared of it. And so I think that one of the things that would be helpful, right, is basically, using the existing frameworks like co-ops and unincorporated nonprofit associations to basically show that DAOs can be responsible actors and exist with as other entities of that type do. These are just blockchain versions of them. The blockchain, technology allows them to do certain things and get consensus that, would be more difficult without. And I think basically operating within that space, paying taxes, and educating and just kind of walking people through kind of the issues and how this stuff works is really going to be, key. I think that the securities analysis, is the one people probably talk about the most. But I think that it's I don't think that the Howey test is actually all that bad, right? I think that it's enabled a lot of companies to go out and issue tokens. Now, the SEC is currently trying to walk back a lot of the decentralization framework that was put in place over the last 3 years. I think that's pretty devastating, but as so long as the tide there can be stemmed, I think that the Howey analysis was actually a fairly reasonable framework for people to kind of understand how tokens can be issued. And it leads to these decentralized systems that are potentially going to be, revolutionary.
I think also, as far as changes in the law, we need to start having a little bit more honest discussions. You can go onto the crypto Twitter, you can go to Discord, you can find people talking to each other about it, but they need to start educating the rest of the community. If the idea is going to be community engagement, people need to understand how this works. And that's true across all the professions. Like, one of the things that drove me crazy about hearing the infrastructure bill work its way through was the 6050I, the reporting requirement around the Form 8300. It kept getting presented as a tax bill, right? If you watch any news media, you can read any story, it was a tax bill. The IRS collects it, so it must be taxed. That's the Patriot Act, man. That's information reporting, that's terrorism, and the idea the IRS is the one collecting it. Well, of course they are. They're the ones who collect forms. The first thing they do is send it off to a bunch of different governments. And so if we want to sneak it into an infrastructure bill, we probably should have a conversation about what the right level of privacy is and what the right level, in having these conversations. And you can't even have that conversation. People don't understand that we're not talking about tax evasion, but we're actually talking about money laundering in the context of terrorism. It's a whole other conversation. And you can't even have that educated debate because we're all the way back at, people aren't paying their taxes. And it's like, well, that's partially true. People aren't. It's not because of blockchain. It's not because of crypto. But at the same time, we're not even talking about tax evasion. And so getting on message and getting communication out in the communities, we got to stop talking just to each other in the tax community, in the crypto community, in the legal community. And I think we got to start kind of living what we preach on community engagement and collaborative decision making.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly, I think we also need to start participating more on the electoral side, because the truth of the matter is regulators are a little bit more like the cops, and their job and incentives is to go after people and win cases, versus politicians truly do work for the people, and their job's at risk every 2 or 4 years. And so if crypto folks can really educate their neighbors and others and coalesce around these issues and refocus them on the right things, we could have huge impacts and start electing better and more pro-crypto people to Congress. And those are the ones that can write the laws that the regulators then have to enforce. So I do hope we see more of that, both at the state level and especially at the federal level.
I guess I want to add, Connor, to your question on who should participate. Our gripes are also tax related, IRS related, that comes with some specific tax treatment on cooperative. That is like the payment, you're kind of required to pay a percentage of it in cash when you're making distributions. So how do you do that if you're only using crypto, or depending on the type of tokens that you're using? So there are some technical aspects there, but then folks that are doing it, that the DAO folks, the members, the participants, should be the ones driving also those changes, the conversation. As attorneys, as CPA tax professionals, and we can support and we can help identify aspects of the law that are blocks, but it's really about understanding what's being done on the ground, how those groups operate. They know what they're facing as far as issue goes, and how hard it is to get funding. You can form a cooperative, a DAO as a cooperative, and then maybe everybody has access to SBA loans to get that started. Well, a cooperative might need individual guarantees for that. How do you do it with a cooperative, and how do you do that with a Web3 group? It's virtually impossible to have that. So it's really the operation kind of be driven by those that are on the ground, the community that they be engaged. I think those are the ones that are suffering the most. I think having to jump through hoops, and we just need to enable their activity to help and support. And I think, Connor, you're doing those research and survey. I think that's a really important aspect. That's identifying those with not me, who are trying to just kind of draft what I'm described and what I understand from the law, but Bill, who is actually doing the dirty job and making things happen on the ground.
On that front too, I would really plug the work. There are a number of different groups that are starting to do some really good work here. I think Blockchain Association is one, but also Flight for the Future. The Electronic Frontier Foundation is becoming much more involved. It has been for a long time. I should be fair to them on that front. And we're seeing more and more established organizations like the EFF, which have been around for many, many years, that are starting to look at crypto, appreciating the privacy piece, appreciating in many ways, crypto has been, for a variety of reasons, quite popular with Republicans, senators and members of Congress, and we haven't seen that popularity build amongst Democrats. But there's so much promise. There's so many things that Democrats and progressive and left-leaning organizations love and would love about crypto, if, to your point, like they were just a little bit better educated. So hopefully we can see more and more of that happen. And I would love, folks on this call or folks watching, to check out those organizations I listed, and I'm happy to, we can include links to those later, but all great organizations doing really strong work. And CoinCenter too, I think I forgot that, but of course CoinCenter.
I'll also throw out
so
PAC is another
PAC,
on the electoral side. Yeah, because I do believe, like, if Elizabeth Warren understood what DAOs were, she'd be a big fan. But instead, she just understands what Bitcoin maxis are, and that's why she hates crypto. But
Yeah,
I'm also biased because I'm kind of come from the Democratic Party background, so I do have hope.
Right. Yeah. No, me too. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I think we're at time.
Hey, Connor,
now,
Connor, thanks for putting this together, man. Thanks for putting this together, man.
Thank you so much.
For sure. Well, thanks for joining. Really appreciate your time and all of the very engaged conversation on this. I mean, it's I think really important to get lawyers in front of crypto folks. Sometimes they don't want to stick around and hear from us, but the more information we can get out there in open source, the better. So thanks again, everyone. And I will see you later.
Thanks.
We'll now transition out to the governance portion of this session. So we have two more presentations. One will be by Tony Douglas, and the other would be by Kelsey Nabin and Michael Zargan. So we'll start with Tony. And Tony's a second-year student at Stanford in their MBA program, and he's also the head of governance for Stanford's blockchain club. Before Stanford, Tony's professional and academic focus was organizational design and future of work technology. And I know Tony's been doing a ton on the DAO governance front. So I will leave it to you, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Connor, and thanks everyone for having me. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion. Let me share my screen 1 second. All right, I believe we're good to go. So really, what I'm going to go through today is just a discussion on governance collaboration, and in particular, how we're running, our governance program at Stanford Blockchain Club, and sort of some open ideas on how folks can collaborate with us. Before I jump into that, Connor touched on this a bit, but just to give a brief sweep of my background, I started my career at Goldman Sachs as an internal design consultant. Effectively, I was doing process engineering work, decision automation work, target operating model type stuff. And in parallel, I was getting a master's in organizational psychology. In particular, I was looking at applications of machine learning to organizational development. I ultimately built an org design team at Goldman and then left and joined an HR tech startup called Humu. And now in school, again, I'm in the MBA program. I've had internships at Share Ventures, which is the logo on the left, the big S, which is a venture studio, and then the Churning Group, which is increasingly getting involved in crypto. So, here I'm just providing an overview of the presentation, but what I'd say is, like, if nothing else, the takeaway from this is, one, we want to be transparent in how we're thinking about governance and who we've collaborated with and the partners we've had to date. And then beyond that, we just want to invite as many people as are interested to collaborate with us in various ways that I'll touch on, later on in the presentation. Yeah, so first, this is just an overview of Andreessen Horowitz delegate program. And for those that are not familiar, I strongly encourage to Google this title at the top, the open sourcing our token delegate program. And effectively, A16Z has just delegated out governance rights to various stakeholders. And they talk about why they've done this, how they've thought about doing it, and criteria they've had for delegates. You can see in this sort of pie chart to the right, the breakdown of who they've delegated to. So you'll see this big purple section is various university organizations, of which we are one. You'll see on the left how many votes we're responsible for. And the reason I highlighted here the criteria for delegates is we take this incredibly seriously. And we think it's quite a responsibility to be able to participate and really shape protocols that are managing, billions in assets. Is a pretty serious thing. And for that reason, we want to remain committed and engaged in the process. We are independent of Andreessen, though they've been incredible partners anytime we've had questions or need advice or educational resources of the like. And they frequently join a lot of events that we put on at Stanford as well. Part of their criteria for delegates is a diversity of perspectives, which I think is an incredible idea and very necessary as people think about how to collaborate on governance. And then obviously trying to tap into subject matter experts that are within the club. And so it's probably worth touching on. Our club is comprised of people honestly across the school. So whether it be management science and engineering or undergraduates in CS, or we have a graduate program called Symbolic Systems. We have folks from the law school and obviously, like myself, people from the MBA program as well. And really we look at this, these governance tokens as an educational tool. I mean, it's an opportunity for our students to engage with these protocols in a very meaningful way, not only reacting to proposals, but putting forth our own proposals as well. And again, we're looking at expanding this program, though we haven't made that public yet. So I wouldn't speak about the partners today, but we're looking at getting involved in other protocols as well. Yeah, so here, I just wanted to provide an overview. And again, we want to be transparent in how we are running our governance process, right? So, and there's a lot of room for improvement, and I would very much consider this V1 or V1.1 or so. But at first, we just monitor proposals across those protocols very frequently. And right now we're taking a stance that we are primarily reacting to activities that relate to the protocol. So smart contract modification and decisions related to protocol fees rather than activities related to the treasury. For example, like grants and the like. And the reason being is we just want to, as much as possible, remain beyond reproach and not subject to, any biases or people that we particularly like or anything like that. Beyond just monitoring the proposals, what we'll do is then post it in our Discord, which is actually open to the public, and I encourage everyone to join. And then we'll just have an open debate around the proposal, and people will dive into the code on GitHub, read the other resources, and really just provide their unfiltered views. From there, the governance team, which in addition to me is 10 other folks, will synthesize all that information, basically weigh the pros and cons of everything that was presented, and then make a decision on whether to upvote or downvote, and then attempt to reach a quorum. Like, we haven't really had many instances where we haven't post that analysis stage. Generally, we agree, and then to the extent that we don't, we're typically able to resolve that. And we lean heavily on folks that are more experts in the particular decision that's being made. From there, we then pass it on for a final review to the leadership team that just ensures there's no conflicts or other areas of concern within that particular vote. One area that we are hoping to work on, and I think speaks to the collaboration theme here, is posting our analysis publicly more often. So you'll see on the right, us just posting to our Twitter, and please do follow at Stanford Crypto, why we voted for a particular proposal. And this didn't have any super in-depth analysis appended to it, but we're increasingly starting to put those together and trying to get better at documentation and engaging with the sort of like external community to get a reaction to our analysis. Yeah, so our goals within the governance team are on the right. So, I already touched on the participation and commitment and the sense of responsibility that we realize we have. Beyond that, though, is just education and thought leadership. So not only educating ourselves and having this shared learning journey, which I think is incredibly important. And I think it speaks to why this set of talks today was so important, right? We're all kind of collectively learning together. But beyond that, starting to develop some thought leadership. So we have an incredible set of schools that are working on various things that apply to DAO. So, there's a Center for Work Technology and Organization, for example, and a set of researchers and professors that are really pioneering various freelance worker models and other future work technology. So we think that, we have a unique opportunity to leverage these different schools at Stanford and really apply it to governance and hopefully advance this space and engage with folks again in a discussion on how to do that. But beyond that, and a big reason that we were excited to come today was this idea of transparency and growth mindset. I think to date, if I'm being completely honest, we've done things maybe in the dark. I mean, not intentionally, but we just haven't posted as much externally as we hope to. And we want to do that, not only to so people understand what we're doing, what we're working on, what our thoughts around various proposals are, but so that we could get feedback, right? Like ultimately, we don't have it figured out, and we want to refine our governance program as much as possible. On the left, you'll see various ways that we're actively working to do this. So again, I already touched on the more active participation on Twitter. If you were to go to our website, it's pretty bare bones, and we're working to enhance that. One of the key things that we're thinking about doing is just basically open sourcing all the analysis that we do and posting that centrally on our website. And then beyond that, we just have an increased focus on events with external speakers. So if you go to YouTube and type in Stanford Blockchain Club, for example, we've been doing an accelerator in the last 6 weeks. It's really just been an educational series with an incredible group of speakers. And now those are all, posted on our YouTube channel. So I encourage folks to look at that. And in 2 weeks, we'll be doing a set of DAO panels ourselves. We'll post that both on our Twitter, as well as our mailing list that you can join if you go to our website. And then, beyond that, I already touched on documentation that we want to get better at. And then just really encouraging folks to reach out to us and partner in various ways. So one of the last things I wanted to touch on was just, I think various collaboration efforts that I think are worth learning from. We're learning from right now. And I think, the work that Connor's doing through the DAO Research Collective, and they put on a DAO Summit, much like today, I think is absolutely incredible because, again, we're all learning together. I've been able to reach out to Connor and tell him what various folks are thinking at the university, and we have a great exchange of ideas through discussions like that, which I've really enjoyed, and folks within the governance team are excited to get involved in various efforts like that as well. Open sourcing everyone's research. I think this was one of the most useful set of like open source research, if you were to Google this, that I ran into as I was trying to get smarter around DAOs. And then lastly, for those that are not familiar, the Blockchain Education Network has a meta delegate program that's encouraging and educating folks on how to take part as delegates in Uniswap. And so efforts like this, obviously, that bring more people into the space, not only bring them in, but educate them in how to get involved based on their expertise or sort of past academic experiences, I think are incredibly important. And we're always excited to connect with folks that are engaging in these types of activities. In terms of collaborating with our club around governance, I touched on some of these earlier, but people reach out to us and delegate or talk about delegating their governance rights and other protocols, and we're always open to those discussions. We're open to running nodes. I already touched on exchanging ideas and co-authoring papers, and here I would just highlight, again, even within the governance team, we have folks that have a public policy background and have thought about the history of governance and how that might apply to what DAOs are hoping to achieve. And I think that's an incredible sort of area to explore. Beyond that, again, I touched on, the Center for Work, Technology, and Organization, and I am actively talking to the organizational behavior professors there to talk about beyond some of these legal structure discussions that we've touched on today. How can we think about organizational effectiveness within DAOs and really help to ensure people are coordinating as intended around these common goals, right? And then lastly, just partner on educational events. So that was pretty much all that I had. I, again, would encourage to reach out to our Twitter and follow us. We're going to be posting more and more throughout the year. This is the link to our website. And lastly, I'll just say thank you. I really do want to connect. So for those that are curious about anything that's going on that I touched on today, or my independent research is more around, again, organizational psychology and lessons from frameworks and processes there that can be applied to DAOs, please reach out to me, either email, Twitter, or LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thank you, Tony. Much appreciated. And yeah, I think it gives everyone good sense of almost like I think Tony spoke to it, like everyone's still very much learning in this space, particularly as it relates to DAOs and how much new is going on at all times. And so there are many folks who are working on it, but so much more helpful if you can collaborate and share a little bit of knowledge. So moving on to our next session, we have Kelsey Nabeen. She's a researcher in decentralized technology communities. As an ethnographic researcher, she's interested in the human outcomes of digital infrastructure, blockchain community culture, and algorithmic governance. We also have joining her Michael Zargham, who is the founder and CEO of Block Science. Dr. Zargham holds a PhD in systems engineering from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied optimization and control of decentralized networks very relevantly. So they're presenting on the foundations of decentralized governance, and they're writing a paper on that same subject, which they're going to be releasing soon. And after Michael and Kelsey, it'll be the end of the session. So it's been great, jamming with everyone today. We hope it's been useful. Feel free to reach out to us through the DAOcollective.xyz or find me on Twitter, do the same. Really encourage you to reach out to speakers as well if whatever they said was of interest to you. And thanks so much for Uniswap Grants program and ETHGlobal for all of your support and all of your help in us doing this. And so we're going to move on to Kelsey and Michael. They're in two very different locations. Kelsey's in Sydney and Michael, I believe, is in the United States. So they had to pre-record this so they could get on at the same time and coordinate with the event. So we're going to take a second to bring up the video now. I think Andrew's got it going, but I'll leave you to take a look.
Hey, UniCode, really glad to be with you today. I'm Kelsey Nabin, a researcher at RMIT University, and I'm joined by Michael Zargham, founder and CEO of Block Science. And we're here to talk about the foundations of decentralized governance. So the aim of this presentation is to draw on control theory to explore governance dynamics in decentralized, complex, adaptive systems. So first of all, it's worth starting off by questioning, what is governance? What are we talking about when we say governance, and how is it delineated from politics or political processes or a lot of other sort of related but distinct themes? And so in order to define this, we're drawing on the definition from French philosopher Michel Foucault, who describes governance as the art of governing or governmentality in a democratic society as the techniques and procedures for directing human behavior. So this is a helpful way of thinking about governance in decentralized systems as well as the process of structuring the possible field of action for others. Michael, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, yeah. I think it's important to examine what this looks like in both a sort of top-down and a participatory system. So a lot of the times when we think about governance, we think about the specific decision like being enacted or the the process through which that decision is enacted. And in a top-down system, it might be as simple as, someone with the authority to set the field of action for others simply does it and revises it sort of on a whim. In fact, I'm sure we've all experienced that in some sorts of digital, largely Web 2 systems, where what we're allowed to do, what we can see, is the province of the platform provider. As we move into understanding more decentralized systems, or in particular systems with feedback loops between the participants within those systems or the users within those systems and the field of action available to them, that's where we start to examine the complexity of adhering to the field of action as it is versus changing it in the future. And so we can start to examine the processes beyond just the point of decision and expand them to understanding the relationships between the sort of role as participant and the role as governor, especially if these things overlap, which is actually pretty common in a decentralized system.
So that's actually a really nice delineation of what is a DAO and actually understanding the difference between an organization and a set of tools. Because if governance is structuring the field of action, we're not talking about a DAO as a multi-sig, a snapshot, and, liquid token delegation. We're saying fundamentally the most basic DAO is a set of participants and an objective. And so the first step is to make those kind of often implicit assumptions explicit and start to think about how they then apply to governance within that system.
So I think in order to dig into this, we should examine another concept that we've been exploring in our research, and that concept is the governance surface. So if you are doing governance to set the field of action, then there's a sort of field of action for setting the field of action. Now that sounds sort of silly, but we just decompose it a little bit. As an actor within a system, you have some things you can do and some things that you can see, and generally a way of engaging with that system. But in a governance role, whether it's a decentralized or a centralized governance role, there's generally a set of actions that you can take to change that field of action. Now, if networks such as crypto networks or software systems that enable people to do stuff, generally this means software is the field of action. You're pushing changes to code, or you're pushing changes to parameters that are in code, or possibly you're expending funds to maintain or develop future features. There's a range of activities, but if there's a set of actions that you can take as part of the platform, there's also a set of actions that you can take to evolve the platform. And so we tend to delineate the governance surface as the set of things that the governance activity can do. And even that might need to be further broken down, because you might use different processes or have different stakeholders who have rights over, say, the governance of a pool of funds versus, say, the governance of a particular parameter within a piece of software versus the governance of the software writ large, where you could imagine making arbitrary changes to code. And so anytime that you need to say, this group of stakeholders through this process has control over these parameters or these activities which further structure the field of action for everyone else, then we can call that a governance surface. So there isn't necessarily a specific one governance surface for an organization, but anytime we want to look at a governance activity, we can examine what's the set of rules for changing what particular aspects of that system. Kelsey, did you have anything?
Yeah, I really like that. And it obviously then differs between different organizations as well, or different DAOs, or whatever the system you're looking at is. So there's not just one governance surface, but then that will also differ across different organizations. And I think what you mentioned at the start there, in terms of kind of creating a mental model or a conceptual model of what that governance surface is according to the relevant decision, that also requires the designer or the governors to be self-aware and factor themselves and their sort of position and relationship in relation to what they are governing into that picture as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, we have to ask sort of when we move towards participatory or decentralized governance, what does it mean to become informed in order to participate in that process? Because I think we often take governance as a big bucket. And the truth is that an informed participant in governance depends a lot on what they're governing. And so in the case of breaking things down, or in the case of decentralized governance, it's necessary to break things down so that we can better understand which participants have control over which governance surfaces and how we can move towards a informed participatory governance as opposed to just governance. I checked the box, cool, we let people participate, so it's totally going to work. I think we see a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, as an ethnographer and a social scientist in this space, this is something that multiple DAOs are grappling with in terms of how do you have a participatory system where everyone has a say in decision making, but then how do you have a meritocracy as well? So how do you have people that are informed on a specific matter, whether it is technical or fiscal or something else, actually having authority to make decisions on the relevant matters? And so there's kind of still that tension, I think, as communities experiment with figuring out governance and then decentralized governance in terms of, is it everyone makes decisions on everything, or is it the most qualified make decisions on some things, but then how is that actually going to prevent against kind of collusion or attack or you know, undue
who decides who's qualified, right?
Exactly, the age-old problem about how you decentralize the system, who decides.
So I think it's probably time to get into one of the more formal concepts. This is borrowed from control theory, which is the area of my PhD work. For those who aren't familiar, I'm a control theorist specializing in actually decentralized systems. That's what my PhD work was on. And here we're going to bring in a pretty basic concept from, like, you know, intro undergraduate classes on control theory. And that concept is called controllability and observability. Really, it's two concepts, but they are kind of pairs. They're a pair that come together. And so I'm going to give a quick overview of the two concepts, and then we're going to explore how it is relevant to organizations. So in control theory, we have a system that's being built, or generally something that already exists, called the plant. And the plant is a system that you want to steer. However, it's there already, and you need to add actuators and sensors. Actuators are the means of changing the system, and sensors are the means of observing the system. Now, most systems are not completely actuated and completely visible. Some aspects are going to be measurable, meaning you can see what's going on. Some aspects are going to be unmeasurable, but you might be able to make inferences about them from what you can measure. Similarly, you want to control some of the states of the system, but you can't necessarily just set the thing to the point you want. You actually have to steer. You need to accelerate your car. You need to turn the steering wheel. And those controls allow you to collectively navigate the car to where you want it to go, without necessarily just mutating its state to the car is in front of my house, or the car is in front of my, or in the parking lot at the university, etc. So we break down these concepts of observability and controllability in order to determine whether it is possible to navigate a system from where it is to where we want it to be in a sort of abstract space, not necessarily just physical space. And we do this by adding things that allow us to mutate the state of the system and to measure the current state of the system. And in an organization, the sensors are going to look like places where you can collect data, where you can measure progress against KPIs. Not necessarily the KPIs, which are set higher level goals, but the measurements that you take in order to determine whether you're meeting your KPIs. And so what ends up happening then is that you look at your system and you provision some measurement apparatus and some mutation or change apparatus, and then you feed that output back into a controller. And a controller is just a decision-making system. It perceives what it can observe, and it uses that to actuate through the tools that it has. So in the context of decentralized governance, what we're really just saying is that the organization writ large needs to be able to set some goals. It needs to be able to measure its progress in those goals. And then it needs to make decisions about how to use the levers, the actuators under its control to make changes in the system, which they can then observe through the sensors. Part of what makes this difficult is that there's often big time lags, right? So activities that you might take in the short term to drive your goals in the long term might be counterintuitive or opposite what you might expect. This is because the system itself has dynamics, maybe some that you don't even know. And so you have to respond to perturbations or uncertain elements in a proactive way, not just in a reactive way, in order to drive towards your goals. And I'm going to sort of leave this at that for the moment. If you're interested more in these concepts, I would recommend this YouTube video that we've linked, just talking about the basics of observability and controllability and how you provision actuators and sensors for physical systems in order to learn to drive them towards desired outputs. And I'm going to note that we are not really doing the sort of undergraduate version of this in our decentralized organizations and our decentralized governance problems. We're really doing the multi-agent version of this, whole teams of individuals each observing things independently and sharing some access to a collection of actuators. And we need to get this system to steer as a swarm rather than steer as a centralized sort of command and control architecture if we want to be able to think about this as sort of decentralized governance, not just as centralized governance. Kelsey, I know I've been talking for a long time here. Do you want to sort of layer in some interpretation of how this fits into our like social systems, DAO governance design problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really helpful. The way that I think about those concepts coming not from the control theory background is controllability is what levers of control are there in the system. And then when we map that to DAOs, it's who gets to manage those levers. And then observability. So how can the behavior of the system be observed and measured? And again, like who gets to observe and who decides what's happening in the system, and then who then, in that loop, who comes back to the levers, controllability and controls, and then who observes and so on. And so, practically, these concepts lead to really concrete questions that are hyper relevant to design in DAOs. So what in the system is controllable? So what can be influenced? And what is observable? How do we know what kind of critical changes occur in the system and the outputs of those between different states? And then if it is controllable and observable, how much so? From there, what are the effective places to add sensors? So you mentioned we need to kind of measure the states and the outputs to generate those feedback loops, but where and how do we do that? And then the actuators as well. So what are the suitable places and how much effort or force needs to go into those? And so I think one of the most helpful analogies for these concepts is one that you actually shared with me, Zargam, around a car. And so that might take us to our next slide in terms of the size of the governance surface.
Yeah, I will make one comment before we go all the way into sizing the governance surface, and that's that measurement is tricky. And I think it's something that we'll be addressing in some of our other writings, but especially with social science, like science, and the lack of explicit measurables in terms of the things that are our real goals, we're always going to run into challenges determining what our sensors are. The sensors themselves are actually proxies for the underlying phenomena. And so, as a flag for people who are taking this as advice to go plan out their ways of, guiding their organizations, I want to put a reminder that your measurements are always reductions. They're always samplings from the phenomena that you're trying to drive. And so you should always be careful about what you measure, how you measure it, and how you use those measurements, because you might argue that a really important part of your governance surface is actually deciding what your goals are and deciding how to measure those goals, because minor changes in what your measurement apparatus is can actually greatly impact the output decisions about what to do. And that means it's part of governance.
Great. So we get to governance surface, and I think the common, or like a common kind of thought pattern in decentralized systems is that smaller is better. So keep governance really simple so it's controllable, or through the process of trying to, I guess, decentralize or simplify, it's automate as much as possible. So it's free from kind of the vulnerabilities that human intervention might introduce. But coming back to that car analogy, the way that I understand it is there's a certain amount of control that you would like in a car, and observability. So control is, it must have a steering wheel, a gas pedal, a brake, and a gearbox. You actually don't want less governance than that. And then in terms of observability, you definitely want a windshield, you definitely want side mirrors, you definitely want, a dashboard with your speedometer and all those things. And so I think that analogy is helpful when thinking about governance, because it's not about making it small or automating it or making it big, but perhaps you can talk more to the concept of this idea of right sizing.
Yeah, I think the thing to understand is that the amount of actuators that you need depend on what you want to be able to accomplish. So we can think about the car analogy, and we could imagine what would happen if we cut the brakes, so to speak, right? You would lose a degree of control over the vehicle that would be really unhelpful. In fact, it'd become much more difficult to accomplish goals of getting the car to where you want it to be if you could only use the gas, but you probably still could. So like technically speaking, I think you'd retain sort of controllability of the navigation of the 2D plane of the traffic transportation system, but it would become much more difficult. It would be less safe, probably. If you also took away the gas, you would lose your ability to actually modulate your velocity, and thus you wouldn't really be able to control position, even if you could, say, change the steering wheel. You might be at a fixed velocity, but you'd be, in the worst case, just sort of going around in circles. Sort of annoying, silly maybe, but the point here is that leaving the gas and the brake, but removing the steering wheel would also reduce your capacity to navigate somewhere. Now, all along, we're assuming you can see out the window, see where you're going, maybe that you have a speedometer so that you can keep track of what speed you're moving at, and imagine what it would be like to try to navigate that same car without the visibility of being able to see out the window or be able to see your current speed. It's the combination of those observables and those actuators that basically render a car as a useful piece of technology that you as the driver can sort of navigate the gestalt of you plus the machine to where you want it to be. Now, one of the interesting elements of this discussion, the car analogy, is it does beg questions about quote unquote autonomous vehicles. And what's really interesting about it is that the car is only really about as autonomous with, say, the technology that allows it to drive as it is with you in it from a first principles perspective, because it needs you to give it a target destination. So I guess a person plus the car is autonomous in the sense that the person gives the car instructions and the car delivers on those instructions. That's technically true, even if you're not in the vehicle driving it, because you're setting the destination, or a human is setting the destination for the autonomous car. That's a little bit silly, but I want to point out the fact that these technologies and their relationships with humans, excuse me, require us to think about where the goals are coming from. And so maybe without going too far down that rabbit hole, I'd like to point out that when we're sizing the governance surface, we are really working backwards from those goals. If I had really an autonomous car, then my governance surface has been reduced to basically giving the car instructions about where to take me. If I'm the driver of the car, then my governance surface is the pedal and the brakes and the steering wheel, etc. And in both cases, we are working with the same vehicle. We've just, changed the amount of control being exercised directly by the humans, or in this case, the humans that are overseeing that system. And what I want to point out is that the lower level mechanisms associated with the brake and the gas and the steering and the gearbox are actually still there. Even when we automated up, we are just automating the use of those now lower level mechanisms. So we're just stacking things up. And when we automate, that can work as a great way to reduce the governance surface, but it never wholly eliminates the sort of human at the top of the stack, because no matter how much you move up, you're going to need someone to do some goal setting. You could even have a whole fleet of autonomous cars that are taking their guidance in terms of the goal on up another level. And you could have, a continued stacking that ultimately gives up to some profit objective over some measurement over some other, again, higher and higher order goal. But when we think about governance, we can think of it as saying we keep pushing the goal setting, the field of action structuring up to a higher and higher level composite. But we've never really lost the degrees of observability and controllability in the lower level systems. We've just made the governing apparatus a higher level software system. And I like to emphasize this with regards to DAOs, and in particular, decentralized governance, because we're trying to ensure that the top level of the stack of governing apparatus actually points back around at the constituents of that system. And it could end up being a pretty complex network of, expertises and empowering of different humans to monitor, maintain, or govern different pieces of such an assemblage. But if we want to think in a participatory way or in a decentralized governance way, it does make sense to ensure that there's always a loop back around to the automated, the higher level decision-making apparatus, where its measurements and its goals can be changed by the humans who are subjected to the decisions that automation is making. Kelsey, do you want to add anything before we move on to the next slide?
It's a well articulated point, and I think that takes us to the next slide in many ways. It's a whole other presentation, but this idea of autonomy in what we know and love as decentralized autonomous systems has kind of been a bit of an obsession for me this year, and I have a post on my Substack blog in terms of this, asking who or what is being made autonomous in autonomous systems. So I think that point about automation, but still the role of people in systems is really important. And so it kind of brings us to this question of what is actually the objective of governance? And what I sort of have researched, I don't see this super well articulated within decentralized technology communities thus far, I guess. And so we talk about them as evolutionary, but it's a really important question in terms of what are we evolving towards, or what's the aspiration here. And so I really like the definition of autonomy that comes out of the field of cybernetics, informed by control theory, which is what we've been talking about, which is this idea of wholeness. And so, Zagam, you've actually been bringing up for a while that DAOs could think of themselves as autopoietic systems. And what this means is just a fancy word for saying a living organism, or something that is able to make decisions, adapt, evolve, and even sort of self-perpetuate or kind of replicate itself without relying on external resources per se. So that's kind of perhaps an interesting thought provoker, but there's some really great, quite old school kind of literature on that. And I highly recommend someone called Varela from the 1970s, who talks about autopoietic systems and how something that is autopoietic is whole in and of itself, and thus that wholeness, meaning that it doesn't depend on any external factors, is actually autonomy. And that's quite a nice way of thinking about what autonomy could mean in decentralized autonomous organizations.
One of my favorite ways of articulating autopoiesis is as constantly in the process of creating itself, because it's not static. I think this is probably the biggest leap from autonomy to autopoietic that's relevant for DAOs, is that when we think autonomous, especially in a very technical sense, like a closed loop control system that observes, decides, acts, observes, decides, acts, and this is perpetuated, it's dynamic in one level, meaning it's got feedback. Generally, this is feedback control, right? The basis of the control theory literature is the idea that you can go through this process of observing state through sensors and using it to make decisions in pursuit of an objective, to execute on those decisions and observe, even if things don't go as intended. You're continuously able to adapt to the changes within the scope of that model. However, they tend to be static up one level in the sense that there's not really a meaningful way to change its goal unless you stack it with another such system. And we get back to what I said on the previous slide about sort of the human at the top of the stack somewhere setting some goals. In an autopoietic system, the source of the goal setting is also internal. And so we've moved beyond just saying that the system is closed in the sort of informational technical sense around pursuing an objective, but it's closed on itself in a higher order way, meaning it's able to discover and sort of, rewire or continuously create itself. And that sounds like kind of wishy-washy stuff, but I think if we examine a particular DAO that I feel exhibits this property, it becomes a little bit more concrete. So I've been a contributor to the DAO called OneHive. It's a sort of self-organizing system built on the Aragon stack. And in particular, the OneHive DAO instance that's running, or the community that's got their infrastructure running on the XDAI network, has evolved it multiple times. They have many swarms that are independently living. Some of them get big and even fork off into multiple organizations or even other organizations. They get funding through a shared voting scheme. But what's so interesting about it is they've actually made upgrades to their code. They've spun out other sub-organizations that became their own organizations, and they exhibit a lot more of the properties that I associate with sort of living organisms, albeit they are code plus humans doing things that interest them. What interests them has changed over time. Their software infrastructure has evolved with the deployment of new smart contracts. And basically, if you trace the lineage of the project, you'll see ebbs and flows in people, ebbs and flows in code bases, variations in a plurality of objectives pursued by the different swarms, and as I noted, spin-offs of projects that grew out of it. So that kind of situation lends us to believe that it is possible to look at the gestalt of the humans and the infrastructure that they're using as a whole entity in its own right, and that entity is able to adapt its goals. But unlike some of the more centralized sort of stackings, like in the autonomous car or even the fleet of autonomous cars example, it doesn't loop back around on like a single point of decision making. It actually loops around through a collective decision-making process. And the participants within that system have sort of emerged this plurality of objectives that are largely complementary, but they are fuzzier and less bottlenecked on a single point of decision making than some of the more technical examples, and even some of the more technical articulations of the control of DAOs.
Yeah, a couple more points that come up in relation to OneHive as a kind of sort of case study example, and I'm really grateful to members of that community for engaging in research interviews. But the decentralization of that system comes from the fact that no one is setting the kind of high-level strategic direction, although there are shared sort of vision and goals which give the participants in the system the capacity to set their own objectives, I guess, or subsets of objectives. And so a couple of things happen there within the design of the system. And one is that value is intrinsic to the ecosystem, to the way that currency is automatically minted through the smart contract and then deployed through proposals to reward labor in that system, means that even value in that ecosystem is not pegged to any external kind of real world currency, although Honey token found its way to currencies and kind of can be mapped to, you know, a US dollar value or whatever. The other is in the way that the system sort of self recreates or perpetuates. It's not just when mechanisms are built by swarms within the system, such as, you know, adding on different modules, but actually the high level architecture of how that ecosystem runs was recently sort of adopted, I guess. I was going to say forked, but it was adopted by Bright ID. So actually it's creating an evolution of itself, or it's self reproducing, but in a different instantiation, which is really interesting when it comes back again to that idea of autonomy and wholeness. And I think just zooming out and linking to something I said in the first slide is what we wanted to kind of start to explore was how governance differs from other or is distinct from other concepts we see in decentralized autonomous organizations and decentralized systems. And so the way that we've spoken about this and some of the concepts we've tried to draw out are very different from politics, for example, or political processes. But when we come back to, you know, a whole system that is, you know, self-governing, independent of external factors, and this, you know, governance surface and controllability and observability are some of the techniques used to do that, it's very different from things that run on top of the governance surface and also things that run underneath it, such as the fundamental kind of architecture that you've spoken about a couple of times, Argham, and how people sort of sit at the top of those layers.
Yeah, I want to make a comment about the relationship between governance and politics, especially within the scope of this concept, the governance surface. So if the governance surface is the set of actions that governance can take, it's meant to encode a feasible set. So from in a formal decision problem, an optimization problem of sorts, there's a feasibility, and then there's like the objective or the goal. What would make something optimal is the thing that is the highest value in the objective function, suppose you're maximizing, and it has to be a point in the decision surface, or the set of decision variables that are feasible. And what's interesting about the governance surface is that it actually encodes the feasible actions, or the things that can be done, not the measurement of whether that's the right thing to do. And in an environment that's decentralized, there isn't necessarily a unique objective. The objective is a composite of all of the stakeholders who have governance authority or rights in choosing a point from the set of feasible governance actions. And so as we leverage that sort of, you know, decision-making formalism that comes from the theory of optimization, and which is implicit in much of control theory, we're realizing that by decomposing the concept of a feasible action, or the set of actions that can be taken, from the specific action that is taken or is even proposed to be taken, we've opened up a room for an evaluation of a political process in terms of how candidate actions from the feasible set are surfaced and evaluated and discussed, and then ultimately sort of ratified and put into action, and then even the consequences of observed and feedback on future decisions. But because we've decomposed the governance surface as a set of possible actions from any specific action taken, we've actually left room to discover or even realize the preferences of the community through their actions in the governance process or in a political process that gives rise to the choice of an action through a governance process. And so there's definitely a lot of meat that could be further untangled in these concepts, but as Kelsey mentioned earlier, we're not actually doing this for the first time. There is a many decade old theory called cybernetics, which itself examines the application of control theory to decision making in organizations and large institutions, with the caveat that early cybernetics was very top down, very commanding control. And part of the application of cybernetics to decentralized governance is moving away from that command and control view and leveraging concepts from decentralized control theory to understand how to accomplish a informed participatory governance through feedback loops within these living systems.
So perhaps that takes us to our next slide to say that we do have a research piece coming on this, which explains these details or these concepts in more detail and also goes into the case study and as a kind of applied example. So we'd love to share that with you when it's ready. And thank you so much to UniCode for having us and the organizers as well for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And a shout out to our teams. I work with a great team of researchers at Block Science and Kelsey with a great team at RMIT. Anything else you want to add?
Hope to engage with people, I guess. Feel free to reach out to discuss further.
Awesome. Thank you.